Hi, everybody, and welcome back to this study group of the History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps by Peter Adamson. I'm Nerdalliun Plebz, and today with me, Rogério Marques, Graham Pong, and very excitingly for the first time, also Zara. Welcome, everybody.
Nice to be
Nice to
here.
be here.
Great to be back.
Yeah, and another reason for some excitement today is we're starting with Peter Adamson's History of Indian Philosophy. For the first time, we've been busy with the history of pre-Socratic philosophy and Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, and decided to catch up a little bit about some philosophy in other parts of the world that we've skipped out that happened more or less the same period. And yeah, so still waiting for Peter Adamson to get around to doing Chinese philosophy, but in the meantime, we're going to enjoy learning about Indian philosophy together. Looking forward to it.
It's also good to say that we prefer to cover India and Africa as well as China before moving on to more medieval and modern history of philosophy. It would do great justice to have a broader learning of ancient philosophy in general across the globe before starting to mix and match more recent thoughts. So yeah, this was, I think, a nice approach.
Yes, it's just a little bit unfortunate with the Chinese philosophy that Peter Anderson still not started that series yet. It is
Yeah,
in the works, but at the rate that he does episodes, it'll be one episode of Chinese philosophy every 2 weeks. So we'll probably get done with India and the episodes he's made for Africa up to the period we're at, long before he finishes the podcast on Chinese philosophy for the same period. So, yeah. It would have been a nice idea, but maybe it won't work out. Maybe we'll have to use other sources for Chinese philosophy. We'll see what we'll do.
Peter, in the off chance that you are listening to this, please find a nice expert on Chinese philosophy and get a move on, please. It's worthwhile to try to get a grasp on this, what seems to us as natives from descendants of Europe, mostly. Some maybe African mix and whatnot, to get a grasp on different concepts like vocabulary from ancient India. So although we don't need to go into detail on every single word of this glossary, it's here for us to go back as slides in these 3 slides that has some of the most it seems foundational words related to philosophy of ancient India. For instance, there is this ground idea that an arche or first principle is the Brahman, the highest universal principle. It is found in many pieces of Hindu scripture, the expression all is Brahman. It's chanted so many times that it has already been engraved in my mind. All is Brahman. So also when we find pieces of Hindu scripture named things like Bhagavad Gita, this name seems very ominous and strange to us. Maybe it signifies something completely occult or out of the super, out of the natural, or something like that, or an occult meaning that, or cryptic meaning that we are not supposed to know. But rather, Bhagavad Gita means the song of the Lord, or the song of the Blessed One, by looking at the separate words Bhagavad and Gita. Also, a word that people use a lot in contemporary days, gurus. Everyone seeks gurus, or many people seek gurus, or some people assume they are gurus and go ahead, give lectures and whatnot. Sometimes we're not sure if they're truly the real deal or just sophists. But the idea of guru is someone worthy of respect, so their character is of good quality. Hindu teacher or spiritual guide. So it's supposed to be a good thing. Then we have the 3 very related words, moksha, mukta, and nirvana, which are the states of liberation, spiritual liberation, where suffering is transcended, and karma as well, karma, which means the consequences of our actions. And supposedly the person that achieves such a state escapes the cycles of samsara, which is basically the cycles of rebirth, which is funny. For ancient Greeks, rebirth or reincarnation, or the transmigration of the souls, as we've heard so many times from Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato, seemed like a good thing for them, for the Greeks. And for the Hindus, there's a prevalent repetition of this claim that samsara is actually not a good thing. Actually, some thinkers, notoriously, for instance, the Buddha claims that escaping from the samsara, as in logging off from a video game where your character is respawning every time he is killed, is actually a good thing. You stop kind of playing the game. This is a claim, okay. And then, for instance, tapas is the practice of spiritual austerity, very much related to the ascetics. Shanti, peace or inner peace. This is maybe one of the more known words, because we hear so many people chanting Shanti, Shanti all the time. Well, it actually means peace, peace. And then we have the words related to the text, Sutra, Upanishad, and Veda. Sutra is a really curious and nice word, because it means thread or string. And when we look at Sanskrit script, it really looks like threads, because the upper part of the letters kind of forms like a continuous string. So the letters seem like they are all hanging and dangling, as if they were pieces of clothing on laid out to dry on a string. Then there's Upanishad, which means connection or equivalence, or sitting near a teacher. And then there is Veda, which means knowledge or wisdom. So, and the Vedas are the most ancient text that we have extant here. And so these are the meanings. Okay, guys, feel free if you want to inquire something more of these words, something that I might not have touched.
Yeah, so I'd be happy if you go back to the first list of words. There are two terms there that Peter Adamson makes interesting comments about. I forget whether it was in episode 1 or episode 2. But talking about whether there was philosophy in India at all. And he reckons even though they didn't necessarily have a word for philosophy the way Hindus borrowed the term and saw themselves as part of the tradition started by Plato and Aristotle, they had traditions, intellectual traditions, that had all the hallmarks of philosophy. And Peter Adamson basically reckons philosophy is the systematic use of reason and argument and critical inquiry to discover things in the world. So the making of arguments and the refutation of arguments and the critical analysis of arguments. And so he reckons this word anviksiki, I think,
Anviksiki,
is a good term that comes very close to what philosophy at least has become in the West. He also makes the point that a lot of the Upanishads and the Vedic scriptures, even Buddhism and the Jainas, take it for granted that the job of philosophy is to live a good life, that there is a good life, and that the purpose of philosophy is to sort of purify the soul, to heal the soul, and that they're in line with some of the ancient practices of, say, the Stoics or the Epicureans, or even Socrates to a certain extent. But that's slightly different from modern philosophy, the use of arguments and critical inquiry. But so there were scholars doing something that's very similar to modern philosophy, and self-conscious about what they were doing was sort of the use of critical inquiry or investigation. And Peter Adamson also makes the point that more often scholars will use the Indian term darshana, which can be interpreted to mean a worldview as philosophy, which is close to, say, a lay perception of the meaning of philosophy. So if people would ask you, what's your philosophy? They sort of ask you, what do you think of as your worldview, rather than how do you go about systematically arguing and critically inquiring into things. So, so two different notions of philosophy that's at least familiar to many people. One more academic, one more lay, and two terms in, I forget which language this was. Was this in ancient Vedic? Where you said this is?
This is all Sanskrit terms. Yeah.
Sanskrit terms. So Abhisiki and Darshana.
So I have a couple of basic questions as we get started, if you don't mind. So this idea that you just expressed, this worldview idea, you're adding two words to the list, I think, right? I noticed that there's a word here that basically translates to truth and one to knowledge or wisdom. Is there a word that translates to belief? Is it that word you were just talking about? What was that word you just mentioned?
You were mentioning Darsana, right, Nerdalliun?
That's the last one I mentioned, yeah.
Darsana.
But do I focus on the Anviksiki, which is critical inquiry, Darshana, which is literally to see or to experience visions, but can also metaphorically be used to describe a worldview.
Yeah, that's right here. Okay, I see. And
I think it's also worthwhile to mention that at least Buddhist scholars distinguish between belief after wisdom or belief after understanding, and they call it Sada, which has also an equivalent. It's both written in Pali, which is the original, more ancient language, and also Sanskrit. So Sada is knowledge after faith or belief after knowledge or understanding, and they want to clearly distinguish between that one, which is more associated with mature individuals who investigate and think about things, judge ideas for themselves, as in contrast to little children or immature adults who have blind faith, basically.
what's that? What's the word for that? The child's belief.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I didn't get the words from the Buddhist scholar I was listening lectures on. He's called Buddhadasa Bhikkhu. So he mentioned this Sada word, but he didn't mention the word for blind faith.
Okay,
But
that's very interesting.
There is one.
So I wrote Sada down. That's very interesting, because typically in the West, we think of belief as what you have before you have knowledge, right? I believe this, but I haven't tested it out to prove it yet. But this Sada is a cooler word in the sense that what it's saying is, okay, you can know something, but that doesn't mean you believe it yet, right? And so it's a belief that says, no, now it's been incorporated into me. It's been emotionally accepted. I've been adjusted by the knowledge. I'm not just assenting to it. I like that word. That's a cool word. Thank you.
Okay, so any other questions, guys? We have a lot of ground to cover here, believe me.
Well, it's a study group. We'll see how it goes. What's interesting now is the other word for faith. So I'm trying to Google that real quickly.
Yeah, there's an entire big page in Wikipedia on the Sada word.
Yeah, I was going to say, I got some comments in here while Nerdalliun's checking on that one. And my understanding of this is going to be very, very spotty. It's like some areas I've gone into great depth with my comparative spirituality research, and other ones I'm totally ignorant. And it's, it'll be very interesting to see here, and I'll try not to drag it too much there. One thing about the terminology is I keep trying to remind myself that Sanskrit and Greek are both Indo-European languages, because it gets to be challenging sometimes because they're so very, very different. And as far as the whole escape from samsara thing, I kind of see that more as the Indian culture being much more mature than the Greek culture. It's like the Greeks are more like, young, teenage punks where they think it's really cool to go out and stay out till 4 a.m. going to the clubs. And, the Indians are much more the older people, been there, done that. It's just not worth the headache in the morning sort of approach. And I kind of agree with the idea that it's tough to apply the idea of philosophy in the Greek sense to a lot of the older Indian works and thinking, because the Indian stuff is much more of an all-in-one sort of approach, while the Greeks were kind of like parsing things out separately. It's just kind of a different approach, and tough to relate the two.
So I have a comment on that, if you don't mind.
No, tagging on that. Yep.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. So there's a large portion of Western understanding of philosophy that it's basically what Nietzsche said Socrates was inventing. It's a new wrestling match. It's like a fun game, and you're fighting to sort of get closer to the truth. And there's some progress you can make, maybe, but it's basically just one of a number of games, and it's not aimed at. Well. That's probably true of a lot of philosophers in the West, but there's this word here, this Brahman principle that you're talking about, this highest universal principle, and any of the Western philosophers who are looking for the arche are looking for the same thing, right? That's the face of God. That's the one source of all truth, beauty, goodness, and justice. It's like the sun that Socrates was talking about. So it is possible to play that game in Western philosophy, but it's also, let's say 90% of Western philosophy is a fun sparring match, kind of a wrestling game or something like that, which is more akin to what you're pointing out, I think, which is this more juvenile approach, maybe. Does that track?
Yeah, no, that definitely tracks a fair amount. Like I said, a lot of it is a lack of wisdom. I see it. There's wisdom in the Indian culture that's lacking in the Greek one, and that wisdom is that experience, that been there, done that, I know what's going to happen sort of thing. Tag.
Yeah, I follow you. Yeah, it might be Eastern influence that makes most of the archaic type philosophers in the West talked about an Indian influence. So it might be that they're getting in touch with that. Anyway.
Yeah, so I'm struggling to speed read the article here, but I found a couple of terms that seem related to the Sada. Sada may have been the less mature one if I'm reading this paragraph wrong, but another word that's related is pasada, although that may be the less mature one. They say here, pasada is faith and attraction towards a teacher, but is accompanied by clarity of mind, placidity, and understanding. Another term that's sometimes used instead of pasada is bhakti. And basically in Buddhism, the ideal is to move away. So they translate both those terms as something like faith, but they're different kinds of faith. They say here the endpoint of... So you need faith to follow the path to wisdom, which the term they use for wisdom there is arahant. So yeah, so like at the end of the path, you no longer need faith. You have true, wise understanding of the teachings. That would be arahant. On the way, you might have sada or pasada or bhakti, and it's a little unclear to me exactly what order they go into, or if they necessarily came in a different order. So, not super familiar with Buddhism, so that I could quickly do. I actually want to pick up on the relation between, or the comparison between ancient Indian philosophy and ancient Greek philosophy. If I recall correctly, we found several ancient Greek philosophers who very much fashioned themselves like spiritual gurus and had some wild religious metaphysical ideas as well. Socrates had some wild metaphysical ideas that
his divine sign.
even probably the most rational of the bunch. Aristotle had some crazy metaphysical ideas too. And
but he was mild as well. Then we had Empedocles and Pythagoras.
Yeah, so Parmenides and Empedocles and Pythagoras were the more guru cult leader vibe type. Had some interesting philosophical thoughts. So I think from a point of view of the history of philosophy, among the Greeks, there are some cult leaders that we take. Oh, they had some interesting ideas that are interesting from a philosophical point of view, especially if we're looking at the history of philosophy. I think similarly, a bunch of the Indian thinkers or these famous teachers had some interesting philosophical ideas mixed in with a bunch of crazy metaphysical ideas, and many of them fashioned themselves more as cult leaders or spiritual gurus. And we can say, like, well, maybe we don't care for the spiritual guru aspect of it, or the cult leader aspect of it, but they still said things that made arguments that we can look at and are interesting and thought-provoking, even if we think at the end of the day we disagree that they're incorrect.
I don't know why you have to keep throwing crazy as a pejorative behind the metaphysical. I'm actually more interested in that than I am the propositional solid argument stuff. I think they were getting at something. No, yeah. I think we feel like we have to add that in because I have to apologize. We feel that way in our post-Cartesian scientism sort of perspective, but I think they were onto something, and I'm interested in what they were getting at, and I think you are too. But yeah.
They often sneaked in wisdom with their nice stories. That's for sure.
Yeah.
No, I just want to clarify that the reason I throw crazy there is to qualify it, as opposed to sort of sensible metaphysical ideas. So some metaphysical ideas, good metaphysical ideas, other metaphysical ideas, crazy metaphysical ideas. So qualifying a subset of metaphysical ideas as crazy, and saying that even when the philosophers also have crazy ideas, so they need not be metaphysical, they can just be incorrect for any kind of incorrect idea. They could still be interesting to talk about, interesting to study. But people can be wrong in interesting ways.
I'm far too interested in the crazy metaphysical ideas. That subcategory of metaphysics. When Thales says that magnets have souls, I go, yeah, come on, talk to me, because he's too smart. He knows he can't be as genius as he is, and then me just say, oh, well, that idea is just a stupid one that was in your head. There's something to it. I want to find out what it is, but that's my bad temperament. Is I'm attracted to the crazier of the metaphysical ideas. So, so that'll be fun.
Let's move on. We can always return to the words, etymology, and stuff afterwards. So, speaking of India, India is a big place, and it has drastic changes of elevation as well, particularly to the north, and different climates. And what I would argue is a meeting point between major rivers on the northern plain, the Indus-Gangetic plain. We have the Indus River to the east, and then we have a bunch of rivers confluing to the Ganges, which makes basically what is right now the patch of land with highest population density on Earth. And if the population is very dense there, probably there is ability to sustain all these people, at least mediocrely. So these rivers really provide that this plain has a lot of fertility for agricultural production. And a lot of the action philosophically that we will see is to the north of India. I would also like to show you guys a quick tour on the earliest gods of the Hindus. Just a quick tour. Probably some are familiar either directly or by association with the other Indo-European descendants like the Greeks and Egyptians. So the headmaster or the chief of the gods, these early Vedic gods, is Indra, who he's employed in the business of making rain and thunderstorms. Then there is Agni, the fire of God. He works also in atmospheric energy forms like lightning, the sun, and he's very much associated with the sacrificial rituals where foodstuffs and animal body parts are sacrificed to fire. Then there is Surya, the sun god, who is revered as a sustainer of life, called Prakriti, which is kind of like a statement, a sensible statement. It's sensible to have awareness that the sun itself is a life-sustaining principle, and any similarity with Helios is purely coincidence. Helios, that the Greeks later forgot about. Go ahead, if you guys would like to add something.
No, isn't it premature to say that it's purely coincidental? I think you meant that tongue in cheek.
Oh no, not at all. I think that they had kind of scientific or empirical knowledge, and they just smuggled it in with their myths as well, or they had kind of like revelatory reactions to their rituals, rituals related to psychoactive substances like the soma that is mentioned. It comes from herbs, or meditation, or both. Or actually looking at the world and experiencing the world and figuring out that, well, that warmth that you experience in the hot Indian climate actually is providing energy to life in general. It's a sensible kind of realization. So
where did you get that? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's not the most difficult thing to discover that if you create a permanent patch of shade, as people might have been tempted to do, like some kind of shelter with a animal skin or something, that the grass underneath it stops growing. If it's, or at least it's more difficult for a lot of plants to grow without enough direct sunlight, so you can see directly the plants. Right, you could observe just by observing plants that some plants really need a lot of sun to live, and if they don't get enough sun, they die.
And in caves, you will see that plant life doesn't grow, only fungal kind of life. There's a difference. There's an obvious difference. Yeah, go ahead, Graham.
Yeah, no, I was going to bring up exactly that cave situation, which is the darkness and the underworld being the realm of death. You know, the other aspect to it is another vector for the similarity, like between these and like the Greeks, is they're both drawing from the original Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European pantheons, and they're each a different adaptation of it. So the fact that they'd each have some similarities in something like the sun god would not be particularly surprising. I'm going to tag on that.
And to add to that, it's rather tempting to draw parallels between Indra and Zeus, for instance, or Indra and Thor also. So there are clear similarities there as well. And as you will see, also between this guy and Poseidon. So Varuna, the god of sky and oceans. Although Poseidon was known as the Earthshaker and god of the oceans, this one is the god of the sky and oceans. Also moonlights as ruthless punisher of the sinners and the compassionate forgiver of the remorseful. He is also a wind god as well. And then there is last but not least Yama. Who, funnily enough, if you guys have seen the lore of Dragon Ball, or at least have the lore of Dragon Ball in your minds, the character that receives deceased characters in the Dragon Ball universe was also called Yama, and it probably was not a coincidence. There is a lot of inspiration from Hindu myths, as like the main character Goku looking kind of like the monkey superhero that appears in some of these myths. So clearly there are some potential inspirations there between ancient timeless myths and relatively rather recent myths that are kind of common knowledge, more or less. So yeah, this is the last god.
Where are you getting the images on the right?
Oh, so the images on the right are contemporary recent artists, and I added them to add both interpretations, both the ancient interpretation and the new interpretation that contemporary artists are attempting to reinterpret these gods in a way that matches more closely our contemporary semiology, basically our kind of contemporary expectation of how things are depicted and drawn. But rather, it is also to highlight that the depiction or interpretation is arbitrary. In fact, what counts in these figures, these characters, are their character traits, are what they represent. These more ineffable kind of metaphysical things that they represent are way more relevant. The actual depictions, whatever idolatry in whatever sense, they might actually endanger drawing the obsession of people that are rather overwhelmed by their senses, and they completely skip thinking metaphysically about these concepts, about the concept that we call yama, and has, because he is related to death, he has boundless wisdom to impart thanks to that, as represented in one of my favorite Upanishads, which is called the Katha Upanishad, where a young Brahmin receives wisdom from Yama. Yeah, but this is pretty much the early Vedic gods. I lifted at this with these gods. Later on, we will also introduce the other gods that came with the Sanskrit. These gods are before Sanskrit, or rather, when the Aryans arrived, they brought these gods. But then cultures continue to evolve, and other two sets of gods appeared. The Trimurti, which consists of the creator, preserver, and destroyer. Vishnu, Shiva, Brahman, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. Which, to be fair, it's quite tempting to draw the parallel between these three of the Trimurti and what happens in nature. In nature, you see flourishing, sustenance, which nature has in biology, homeostasis, and then death and decay, and you see this end cycle. So it's kind of tempting to think that really smart people put these concepts in these myths and in these figures, so that people would learn these profound truths without even realizing that they are philosophizing or that they are kind of doing any mental work. I'm kind of tempted to think that this could be like exoteric kind of material for the common public that are not philosophically minded.
We're in the realm of the mythopoetic right now. We're in that dream image realm, right? Where you're talking about like what the character stands for, in a sense, is the profound meaning. And you mentioned that in narrative, it's what the person says, it's what they do, it's how they interact with other characters that you get that truth out. The one slight addendum I would put on what you said, although I think your warning against idolatry is correct, right? You've got this image, and if you're looking at it too simplistically, you say, okay, this piece of rock here is what matters. And the fact that I own it or I salute it or that it's here, that's obviously the danger of the image, is that you make an idol out of it. However, just like what happens characterologically in the narrative presentation of these characters, I wouldn't say that the symbols are arbitrary, right? Like there's truth in the sculpture or the painting that you can be found in the way the object's being held, that tells you something about the character, right? So if truth can be portrayed or meaning can be portrayed artistically, the one slight addendum is, I would say, let's look really carefully, if we're in the realm of the mythopoetic, at the objects that are being held and the way that they're being held. If you want to go back to Surya really quickly,
yeah.
Could you do that? So, okay. All right. So So another thing we can say is we brought up the idea of, okay, well, what about the Western and this Eastern and the dialectic between them? Obviously, there's something Apollonian about the Suryayan, right? Like the sun god. You can see in the modern one, like look at the horses. They're being held back. You see how they're not running wild like war horses would do. Okay, I'm not going to get into it, but that imagery and the symbolism of it is saying something, like you said, on a deeply profound emotional level, because the image is there when you can't yet articulate something, or when you're trying to talk about something so profound that it's not articulatable. It can't be reduced to propositions. So the artist is saying, look, come and meet this. This is a personality in the world. And so since we're not yet into the philosophical, we're in the mythopoetic, that was the only thing I wanted to say, is that we can look at the image and relate to the art, and the artist is trying to help us to relate to whatever the deeply profound truths are. The next thing, and I'm sure you did this on purpose or noticed it, we've got the first four big gods you talk about. It's earth, air, fire, and water. Yeah, right.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, air and then fire.
When you did the first three, I was on mute, and I said the next one is air. Before you got to Verenya, I said the next one is air. It's wind, it's sky, and then you went to it. I was like, okay. So what is it that these people are doing? It seems like they're arbitrarily just talking about gods and personalities, and they don't understand. We like to think, oh, they don't understand where lightning comes from, so they make up a personality behind it. It's not what they're doing. What they're saying is, I want to know what's true about the world in which I live, and these are the things I have to deal with. There's matter, there's space, there's time, and there's energy, right? And so the terms that we use scientifically, we think they're so superior, but it's predictable that our wise ancestors are noticing those four chief principles. Anyway, I don't want to talk more about it, but the only other thing I felt like saying was sometimes we struggle with this idea that, well, how much science did they know? How smart were they? Is this the best they could do? They had these stories about these gods, and maybe they would realize there's a connection between the sun and things growing. It's like, yeah, I agree with you. Of course, obviously they knew that. The strange assumption I've been making lately is they probably knew more about the world than we do. And it's not, it doesn't fit with our pride to say that. And it sounds like maybe I don't mean it when I'm saying that. But the ancient Greeks built things out of concrete that are still around today. And nobody can build a concrete driveway that sticks around for 5 years without cracking. So it's not so crazy to imagine that people who are building pillars that don't crack for thousands of years had better technology and knowledge of how the world worked than we have today, since we can't do that. You build a concrete driveway, it's going to crack within 5 years. I'm sorry, but I don't mean they had satellites. I just mean they weren't stupid, right? Their understanding of how the world worked with whatever technology they had. I tell the story to Rogério, and I won't tell it now, but it's that time machine thing that I'm trying to sum up here. If we went back, we wouldn't live for 2 weeks in their world. They were paying such careful attention to the world that they could thrive in those harsh conditions. But if you brought someone here from the ancient past, they could learn to use an iPad and probably take over the world within a few weeks. That's the summation of the story. In any case, I'm going to shut up now, but those were some thoughts.
I was going to say, I think one of the big advantages they had in the past is they hadn't come up with the concept of designed obsolescence yet. And just building on your concept on Surya there, one of the aspects of the horses is that there are 7 of them. And that brings into line, 7's one of those traditional numbers. And the big one, especially when you're dealing with the sun, is that's the other astronomical objects, the planets and the moon. Because you have the 7 of them, and all harnessed under control of the sun. Also, another one would be an aspect of the whole 7 chakras. Anytime you see 7 chakras, especially in India or Hindu, you got to think chakras as well.
Did they have 7 days in their week?
That I do not know.
I don't know either, but they may have. All right. Anyway, yeah.
Gonna tag on those.
Keep going. Keep going. That's right.
And I added a quote here after the gods by this. Now we have a pair basically writing the text. Jonardon Ganeri, who is the specialist from New York City, one of the universities. The name is blanking out, but he's a specialist in Indian philosophy. So they wrote, "India may challenge and expand our notion of what philosophy is and could be." And yeah, we're approaching this, and as Zara mentions, yeah, we can think propositionally, like the Greeks thought a lot. But we can also look at what these myths mean at a psychological level, like Jordan Peterson did with his Bible lectures, which were pretty profound and revelatory, to say the least. Although, like Adam and Eve's story probably isn't literally the thing that happened, the personality types and the psychological significance of what is going on, of how we portray shame and sin and whatnot. It speaks a lot to what people at the time were concerned with, and also in a more broader sense is a commentary of human nature on itself. And so if these myths have sticked on for a long time, chances are many people perhaps resonated with them, and maybe people resonated with them or were drawn to them because although they might have some things that are literally not true, they might also have stuff that's profoundly true at another level. So I think it's also important for us to, when we look at these myths, to, even though we might have the temptation to discard them and even throw out the baby with the bathwater at sometimes, maybe that would not be wise, because there are some rather profound truths in these myths, and the Hindu myths are quite over the top in profundity, I'd say.
These stories are the stories that took poop-throwing apes and made them cathedral builders and temple builders and pyramid builders. For God's sake, the literal truth is the least interesting way in which something might be true. All right, we're in this post-Cartesian world where the literal truth is the real truth, and all those other things, they're sort of approximations. Just turn it upside down. It's not that our ancient ancestors couldn't think literally. It's not that they couldn't, like you pointed out, understand a scientific causal connection between things. It's that that's the least interesting thing to be preoccupied with. The metaphorical truth is just so much more profound. And so all we have to do is revalue that structure and say, you say to a fundamentalist Christian, of course it's literally true. Look how much more true it is than that. And you say to a Dawkinite atheist, of course it's not literally true. That's the least interesting way it could be true. Look how much more profoundly true it is than that. And anyway, that's, I think, a suggested approach.
Just for the fun of it, I think I'll take a counterpoint here. So I've been looking at the history of decision support systems, and Graham was kind enough to point out that there's been some recent advances deciphering some ancient cave art. And those cave arts seem to be literally true rather than symbolic or metaphorically true. So they had pictures of animals and then count marks for lunar months after the start of spring, after the thawing of the ice, when those animals will be around mating, so be around in large numbers and relatively vulnerable to attack. And that's a very kind of scientific way to do. So you have a calendar marking a schedule when to do things. And in ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest writing records were accounting records. So they were accounts of grain harvest amounts and bottles of oil and the like. And they were used to plan rations. So like the rational kind of recording, more ancient than some of the more mythopoetic kind of stuff. And I might say, I think that might be more fundamental to life. Because say the counts of when the animals will be around for hunting, very important to have food so that your family doesn't die. Similarly, accounts for how much grains was harvested. Very important for planning how to spend that grain in the intervening time until the next harvest, so you don't run out of food and die of hunger. Once for thousands of years, you have stable communities that can feed each other. The main risk become people killing each other, getting really angry at each other and murdering each other. That becomes a bigger problem than people starving. And then you start telling stories about like how it is that the gods get angered and what kind of injustices and betrayals and movements in the heart and the soul move people to atrocities and that kind of thing. So I think maybe the literal truth came first, and then metaphorical truth came after that, and then sort of slowly we... Actually, I think we enriched both kinds. Like, we still have storytelling, and we still have people who major in the arts and philosophies and history and in film and in dance. Like, that's still a thing. Just very recently, science has become super useful for even those things. Like, a background in science can help you do computer simulations that can become really cool video games, or it can become really cool animated movies. And so you can use scientific skills in the realm of the arts. A little bit more tricky to go the other way around, although that happens. You get people who do very, very creative ways to visualize data in ways that lead to new insights and stuff. So we still have both of those around today, and in richer ways than they were around. So I'm not sure I buy the obsession with rational thinking at the expense of artistic thinking.
Well, I tried to invert the thing, and then you just put it back on it. You moved it back around where it was supposed to be according to our instincts. I want to say so two things. This is great. So the first thing is the reason why I said, of course, it's literally true. Look how much more profoundly true it is than that. I think that is actually the right approach. There is to say, you know, there's literal truth. But the reason why you're making that argument is to say which one comes first, right? Which one's primarily more important. And the story that we're used to is this idea that, well, we had to understand enough things about farming and domesticating animals until we could have a caloric surplus, and then when we had all of the benefits of that, then we could sit around and do philosophy and art and start being concerned with some of these other things. I think you got closer to where I want to be at the end of what you said, which is there's a dialectic between these ways of thinking, right? So I'm not actually trying to bin science and say, well, throw that out, throw philosophy out, let's just stare at statues all day. But because our current attitude is so inclined towards the one, I'm trying to push back in the other direction. There is a dialectic between the two. So like you said, science is helping us to do art. But the brilliant insights of the greatest founders of science, they're all philosophical and actually based in dream, as you suggested, that there's this imaginative component to when Darwin saw a tripartite formula for nature selecting advantageous variety from hereditary populations. He had this magical insight after wrestling with a whole bunch of data for decades. That's what allowed all of modern biology to have a billion other questions that are amenable to empirical consequence, where a bunch of technicians can go through and find all the answers to all those different individual scientific questions. So you're not going to get to the moon without science, but you're not going to get to the moon unless you dream about getting to the moon first, right? So you need both of them. And I would say that about the paintings, yes, we shouldn't be surprised that they contain scientific literal truth. I bet you that if you took a team of biologists, geologists, ecologists, the best ones in the world, and you asked them to do as good a job hunting as our ancient ancestors 250,000 years ago did, they wouldn't do a better job of it, right? If you just said, okay, you live in this cave for a month, let's see how much you can hunt. So they had they were very much attuned to what was true literally at the same time. But all of the little statues that we find of the little fat Venuses, right? The little, extra exaggerated reproductive organs that from 150,000 years, I'm guessing, I think it's around there, that are just all over the planet. It's like, wait a minute, that is telling you a scientific truth. It's telling you a truth that matters scientifically, but it's also saying, here's who you are. Here's how you need to relate to the things around you. Here's what's important for you to pay attention to. And I find that if I look at the cave paintings, the experience I have now is the same as if I'm looking at the statue of David or Venus. It's just, I'm kind of silent for 3 hours and it's shouting a bunch of, it's the same thing that like a 3-year-old gets when they rewind and rewatch the same Disney movie every day. It's like, you're saying something to me. I can't tell you, I can't put it in propositions, but something really profound is happening here. So I'll shut up on that and say, yeah, it's a synthesis, like you said at the end. And I'm just trying to pull back against our post-Cartesian scientism obsession with the idea that the literal truth is really where all the truth can be found.
I was going to say, I want to chime in here with, I think the primary aspect of literal truth and why it dominates today is that literal truth as a day-to-day and with very rare exceptions is much more profitable than mythopoetic truth. You know, when you can sit there and you can, the bean counters are they're much better at making a living and making things that way. A couple nods.
They've accomplished so much.
Go ahead.
No, I'm agreeing. They've accomplished so much. I mean, there's I would say most philosophy departments in the West are headed by and mostly composed of philosophy professors who have penis envy for science. They think the entire purpose of a philosophy department is to argue successfully that science is the right way to think, that just point a sign towards the STEM fields and then you're done with your job and there's nothing else to do. That's not every philosopher, obviously, but it's a trend I've been pushing back against for a long time because I think it's stupid. But yeah, there's a lot of this penis envy. It's like, oh, we have iPads and supersonic jets and we can go to the moon. This is where all the truth can be found. And I think it's where the least interesting but most helpful truth can be found. Science can do things other ways of thinking can't do. You know, you don't want to throw it away. And if you think you know something about the empirical world and the scientists disagree with you, the scientists are right. But that doesn't mean that all things that there are to know are amenable to empirical consequence from the perspective of a fictionally objectified world, which is what science is doing. They're modeling the world in this fictional object sort of a way, and then they're accomplishing a great deal. And it's wonderful what they're doing, and it's great. They wouldn't be doing it if it weren't for philosophy, and there wouldn't be philosophy if it weren't for speculative, mythopoetic, imaginative, creative, dreamlike language that came before it. I'm going to stop trying to make that case. I'm just going to let it rest there. And if I'm wrong, you guys can shit all over it and then we'll move on to something else.
I was going to say, go ahead, Rosario.
No, go ahead, Graham. Go ahead.
I was going to say, my response to that is I see that as kind of chicken and egg sort of thing. Because originally, back in the day, there was no separation between the mythopoetic and the realistic. And, you know, a couple of more examples from what Nerdalliun was talking about was the whole Egyptian calendar was based off of the rising of Sirius, which was directly related to the flooding of the Nile, which was the whole feeding, the agriculture. You know, if you know a couple of weeks ahead of time, all of that, it's much easier to plan your society around that sort of situation. Another one is the Indian temples. Is one of the people I follow on YouTube is Parvin. I forget what his name is, but he goes into all the ancient temples and explores them for things. And one of the things he's shown is there are a lot of knots in those ancient. They're carvings of knots. Those are actual knots as opposed to fake knots, because there's a big difference if you've studied, knot theory and mathematics. Those are actual. They some of the temples, they have all the basic knots laid out there for people to use. And if you think about it, that's, again, very, very basic, fundamental things laid out there to express to the common people. Going to tag on those.
I agree completely with that, by the way. It's two rails of a train, and you got to rest on both of them. The revelation that we need is that mythopoetic thinking is thinking, and it's thinking about the world, and it can get you truth about the world. It can get you truth about the world, and we like to think there's only one way of thinking, Well, our ancients had access to the capacity to think scientifically and to think causally and to make connections between things. They also had this other thing, and we've just given up that one other thing. But I agree with you completely. It's the chicken and the egg are both the same creature. So I'm going to.
Let's give a few examples so that the conversation can be powered, because so we don't have the pumps running dry, so to speak. Okay, so here is an excerpt from one of the Upanishads that Jonardon and Adamson were so gracious to include. It is oneself which one should see and hear, and on which one should reflect and concentrate. For by seeing and hearing oneself, and by reflecting and concentrating on oneself, one gains the knowledge of this whole world. So the Upanishad of the Great Forests. And they included this for an important reason. This kind of sets the tone for a huge chunk of Indian thought, which is a bit more inwardly facing than Western philosophy in general, and Greek philosophy that we've been going through recently in particular. And well, maybe it's because they were so overpopulated, as per the example that Nerdalliun gave, of when people become really accumulated in cities that are densely populated, as likely happened even before the Sanskrit wielding Aryans, before they arrived, and the Harappans were in the Indus Valley. They already supposedly had developed plumbing way back then, in 5,000 years ago or something like that. And likely ethics and telling people stories for them to be inspired to have pro-social ethics becomes in order. And so it's not a wonder, it's not so surprising that so many Upanishads, the two major Hindu myths that I will show you guys in a few moments, in a few slides, really emphasized people, the importance of people to behave and be good to one another. Maybe it really does have something to do with how the geology of the Indus-Gangetic plain drove up population numbers so easily due to its fertility. Maybe it really was the garden to the east of Eden. Eden was in Mesopotamia, and this is to the east of Mesopotamia. Maybe this was the Garden of Eden before what it became since then, because now it's all very, very much urbanized. It's very developed, and there's arguably has been, since at least the Middle Ages until now, a lot of squalor in those places because of the high population. So I think this is a really nice showcase of what Indian thoughts set out to resolve.
So if we're gonna try to, this is all new to me, trying to think the philosophy of India. I'm really excited to be here to learn a lot of stuff from the sources that I don't really know anything about. This quote that you just put up there that's on the screen, isn't that exactly an encapsulation of what we were talking about the difference between the mythopoetic way of thinking? They see knowledge of the self is knowledge of the world and vice versa, right? Because it's all relational. So if you have a relationship with somebody and you learn something about them, they have a quirk and you're not sure what it is, but you get to the bottom of it, you simultaneously know something about yourself. I've learned how you're different from me, right? So knowledge, relational knowledge, is at one and the same time of both the related parties. The way the mythopoetics are understanding their place in the world is as relational. That's why they have deities and personalities behind everything. They're not personifying it. They're seeing it from the start as, okay, I exist as a character in a narrative, and I have to relate to the other characters. And because of that, knowledge of oneself becomes knowledge of the world. And here's the last little grenade I'm going to try to throw into our temptation to think a certain way versus how I think. it will be helpful for us to think, if we want to understand what Indian philosophy is doing, if it really is mythopoetic like this, is this idea. We have this Marxist materialist view where it's like, okay, how did people thrive so well in this area? Maybe it's the rivers, maybe it's the oil, maybe it's the gold, maybe there's some material explanation. But what we can look at around the world today is that there are people with no natural resources who are flourishing, and there are people with a lot of natural resources and they're starving under tyranny and slavery and death. It's like, it might be that what people bring to the story is more important than the physical reality that they find themselves in. And maybe if people are flourishing, the people in that land have an ancestry of humanity that had such insights into who they were and how they needed to relate to culture, nature, and the divine, that we should be paying attention to what it is that they have to tell us about our place in the world. Is that tracking?
I'd say there's some interesting thoughts there. The notion of human beings being relational creatures, and that's maybe why knowledge of the self reflects knowledge of the world, is an interesting thought. I had a slightly different thought, and I think probably both of these thoughts are quite different from the way Indian philosophers have interpreted that notion. So I would say that people are, well, they profoundly and deeply imitate each other in ways that often go unnoticed by them. So there's like really wise advice: choose your friends carefully, because like you become them over time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the people you spend time with have a profound impact on our personalities, and especially when we're younger, less so when we're older, but still when we're older. Anyway, so learning to know oneself, you are going to sort of see traces of your mom in there, and you're going to see traces of your dad in there, and you're going to find relationships between you and your mom and your dad by looking at yourself, and those relationships are going to echo the relationships other people have with their moms and dads, your mom and your dad had with their mom and their dad. So there's going to be echoes of the world outside to be found on the world inside, mostly because we have this wonderful capacity to absorb the world inside, information about the world outside on our insides. Another way in which this can be interpreted is if the main concern with the world here, like what conception of the world are they using? If they're mostly concerned with the world of characters and relationships, it might be true that over the average, most people are quite similar. So for the average person to gain deep knowledge about themselves, they're going to simultaneously get deep knowledge about other average people, who are most people. So if you say this to someone who's very unusual in a specific way, to someone who has autism spectrum disorder, or a narcissist, or a sociopath, or whatever, you say, look at yourself, you'll figure out the whole world. It's probably not going to work as well for them, but then for like just an average Joe, it's going to learn a lot about a lot of other average Joes just by investigating themselves. So that's another way to make sense of it. It could be more religious than that, like say a view that the whole universe is a lot more similar to the way a human body and a human mind is structured than what we would take it, which may just be incorrect.
Yeah, we don't need to agree with that to recognize that that's how they're thinking. So for them, the relational knowledge is not restrained to the sociological or the cultural. It's not just knowledge of the people around me. They're seeing the catastrophes of nature as having intention and personality, and they're trying to relate to the deities that are expressing themselves through harvest and storms and other things in exactly the same way that they try to get to know their lover, or like Adam knew his wife. That's the way they want to know the world. They want to know the natural world and the divine world and the human world in that relational way. This is why the Buddha on this quote is saying knowledge of oneself is knowledge of the whole world.
It's not a Buddha. It's one of these rishis that are wise sages from before Buddhism, actually.
Okay, good. I misheard that earlier. Yeah. No, thank you. Okay, so this sage is saying he's encouraging his acolytes to go one of those two routes, which is to say, okay, figure out yourself and you will simultaneously know things about the world. Now, we don't think that's the case. We don't believe in a priori knowledge. We believe in go and investigate and collect data and do some science experiments, and that's how you find out about the world. I'm not saying that we need to throw that out and say it's wrong. I'm saying this crazy paradigm shift I'm banging on about, I think it might be the key for unlocking the meaning of what people thinking this way were communicating to each other. It's the way that they would have received it, and it's what they would have meant when they were saying it. And so that's why I'm banging on about it, because I suspect that that's the case. To explain how knowledge of the self could be knowledge of the world, you have to take on that mythopoetic perspective, which is that so here's something that might help us to do that a little bit. Let's make it easier on ourselves. We believe in science. I believe in Darwinism. I really believe in Darwinism. I'm gonna believe in Darwinism more right now than you've ever heard somebody believe in it before. I'm going to say that what I am, the entirety of what I'm capable of being and what I am, is nothing but the consequence of the cosmos as a whole chipping away at all the parts of the stone that are not David, right? Chipping away at everything that doesn't fit in well with it, okay? Nature has selected away anything that isn't related to it and oriented to it properly to produce whatever sort of a creature I am. But what the sort of creature I am is a personality. I have a personality. And that personality is nothing but the consequence of nature taking away everything that doesn't fit in well with it. So why is it so crazy to imagine as your starting point that there's personality in the world? Where the hell else did it come from? Do you believe that there's a God that just breathed personality into the cosmos? Or are you really scientific enough to say personality and character evolved because that fit in well with what the cosmos was selecting as things that fit in well with it? And I know that's a crazy thought, but let's use that as a way of prying up our overcommitment to literalism and say, well, like we read a novel, we can adopt the perspective of the novel. Let's try to adopt it, maybe. At least I'm presenting it as a tool that we could use to adopt what seems to be emerging as a necessary mythopoetic approach to the propositional wisdom that these philosophers, if they all stick with quotes like these, are the way they're thinking and the way that their initial audience is thinking when they receive it.
Sorry, Rogério, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to unmute. I'll try to address and add to what Zara said. So, yeah, evolution, biological and even cosmic evolution, in a broader sense, tends to select four species that are attuned to the contingent environment that's going on at that point in time, at each specific point in time. Most of Earth's natural history, according to the record, was microbes without much exciting multicellular stuff happening. But suddenly, multicellular life and more complex forms of cells, before multicellular life became a thing. And the direct explanation in terms of Darwinism and natural selection is that they were fitter to their environment in a strict sense. But in a more broader sense, these life forms with added complexity had more adaptability, even for differences of environment. So they were even more selectable for, even more viable than life forms that were way less tolerant with environmental changes. And as we know, environment has been changing in all the history of life on Earth. And if we do a skip to human beings, although we are frail, our bodies are frail, and we need environment to be in specific temperature and many other parameters within a comfortable and physiologically enabling bounds. we can also re-engineer and change our environment. And so we are kind of doing everything that we can because of our traits and our capabilities to be even more selected for than life in general for the previous existence of life on Earth. So maybe this is kind of like the little yield that evolution gives us, which is very slim for every iteration of the generations. But even if it's just negligible, that complexity increases. The very small increase in complexity that sometimes accumulates and sometimes arises has went from microbes to human beings, but it took half the history of Earth to do that, basically. But I think this
And the
is
bacteria are still doing way better than we are. There's much more
yeah.
bacteria. So it's not clear that this tiny tip of the pyramid is going to be around as long as the base. Maybe some other thing that's going to come out. Yeah, absolutely. But bacterial singular cellular life isn't boring unless, if you are a single cell, it's certainly not boring what's happening, right? So, I wouldn't want to be a singular celled organism because I understand existence, from my perspective. But you're absolutely right. There's this plethora of of life affirming. Chemistry has become life somehow, and we're not sure how yet, but it's happened all over, and it's been single cellular, for most of the time, and in most instances, right? There's more bacterial life than there is complicated stuff now. But anyway, I don't know. I'm agreeing with you, but I don't see how that. I don't think that makes me feel like we're insignificant or something. We're clawing our way towards that complexity thing.
Let's go to the Hindu texts now. So to avoid only staying off topic. Okay, so I added here a few slides on the major early Hindu texts, and the two major. These were really mythopoetic works. The Ramayana, which means literally the coming of Rama, which is the titular hero of the this myth, sits around 7,000 years ago, and which it had a sequel, Mahabharata, the great tale of the Bharatas, which are probably are the descendants of Rama's sibling Bharat. Sits more or less 5,000 and a change of years ago. And here I added a carving that I found really pretty, that is found in one of the temples, that represents the legendary city where Rama and his brother grew up before venturing out into the wilderness for their adventures. And then we have to the right Rama fighting his nemesis Ravana, and there's some symbology going on there. Rama is this figure that is pretty much in tune with nature and how the natural order of things, and piety towards the divines. He pays attention to divine wisdom, and it's patently shown a lot. He also is doing, while he is living in meager means in the forest, he's living an existence based on the essentials: roots, fruits, vegetables, and other plant-based foods. And pretty much all the demons that he and his brother Lakshman encounter in the wilderness, that are taunting and slaughtering the Brahman ascetics, are all depicted as voracious meat eaters. So, and they clearly show in this Ramayana story the absolute contrast. These guys are vicious meat eaters. They are called demons. These guys are either descended from the gods or avatars of the gods themselves, Rama and Lakshman. and these guys live much more humble existence, which is associated with their noble character traits and higher virtue. And then Ravana, who is the guy that kidnaps Rama's wife Sita, he is depicted as having many heads, maybe as having a supreme intellect. He's only intellect, but he has no ethics. He has no nobility. He just wants more and more. He's very greedy. He wants more wives and more women. It's not that he was single when he kidnapped Rama's wife. He just snatched her because he wanted more. Basically, this was a contrast that was very apparent in this myth. Okay, tagging out and letting you guys add points or ask questions. Feel free to ask any questions, because before we started the 20th session, I had read the Ramayana.
Yeah, just a point of clarification. The dramatic dates are when the story is set in, but it's not when the texts were composed.
Exactly. Yeah. Good point. That's pretty much what I was intended to mean.
Yeah. So would these be fall under the Upanishads or the Vedas?
These are neither. These are neither Vedas or Upanishads. The Vedas and Upanishads are next. These are called Dharma texts, while the Vedas have their specific name, and then the Upanishads. Since there are so many texts, I found this really useful to figure out how they are classified, following the tradition pretty much of Aristotle. If he were alive now, he would be classifying the crap out of all this.
Yeah. I was going to say, from my studies, these are the two foundational works of Hinduism and pretty much Indian civilization. Everything pretty much spins off of these two. And if I remember right, Rama had a couple of other brothers as well. There were like 4 of them that were born at the same time, if I remember properly. But yeah, no, it's the dates are interesting as well. Those are intriguing. They with the Mahabharata, being associated with that Harappan civilization, and the Ramayana, that's one of those that's 5000 BC date is one of those dates that's associated with a lot of cultures, where that was when like the world started over as well. And just an interesting aside is one of the many proposed locations for the Garden of Eden is in India, in the Saraswati river valley civilization before it dried up. And that was the being booted out of Eden was when that dried up, and that they had to relocate. Just going to tag after all of that.
It makes sense, and well, we don't know for sure, but it's plausible.
Do you go back one slide?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I had a quick Google search because I like to just get a sense from like when the things were composed. I think I did a prior Google search for the Vedas, and I think they were written down much later, but it seems the oral versions of them, estimates for when they were composed based on linguistic analysis, dates them to somewhere around 1500 BCE, or maybe a little earlier than that, no earlier than say 2000 BCE. And with the Ramayana, the earliest estimates for the dates would be around 800 BCE, and for the Mahabharata, the oldest parts, the earliest dates would be around the 4th century BCE. So the Vedas older than these texts, probably influenced them.
Huh.
Speaking of the Vedas, okay. So Mahabharata is based on the descendants of Bharat, which he branched out into 2 lineages, the Kuruvas, which were the more earthly kind of guys. They were more in number. There were 100 of them. They were kind of more greedy and scheming, envious of the Pandavas, which were 5. And they were less in number, but more excellent in character and also in abilities. For instance, Bhima, to the left, who is sitting next to his club. He was kind of like the archetypal Hercules character. He was the archetype of strength, son of Vayu, the god of basically the forces of nature, wind. While Yudhishthira was the son of Dharma, who arrived on a chariot and bore and acted as a surrogate father for Pandava. Was cursed; he could not conceive. Otherwise, he would die during coitus, basically, due to being, so to speak, cursed by a rishi he killed without intention during a hunting trip. And then there is Arjuna. Arjuna seems particularly special of these five, because Arjuna was conceived only after the couple Pandu and his wife Kunti, who is the mother of all these five. Rather, the first three, except the twins. Only after the two did extreme asceticism during a year, standing on only one foot during while the sun was out. And then afterwards, she just, as she did with Yudhishthira and Bhima, she only did need to recite her mantra, that she was peculiar in knowing a mantra to call the gods and ask them to do her bidding. She was the only one with this knowledge. She then called for Indra, the chief of the gods, and then he appeared instantly. So after a year of intense self-discipline, the kind of payoff appeared instantly, and Arjuna is considered exceptional overall. He is kind of a well-rounded human, I would say. So a great leader, good in many skills, etc. While Yudhishthira was more lopsided, and Bhima as well. Each one, Yudhishthira a bit more intellectual, while Bhima more physical, and Arjuna more well-rounded. And the twins are less important as characters. Then in the middle is what I would say the most famous part of the Mahabharata, which is chapter 52, the Bhagavad Gita, that occurs in a transitional period when the war between the two families, Pandavas and Kauravas, is about to start. And it depicts a dialogue, a really superb dialogue between Arjuna, who is sitting in the chariot, and his chariot driver, who is called Krishna. And this Krishna is actually the avatar of the preserver, basically, of Vishnu. And there is a lot of ethical precepts handed down from Krishna in this dialogue. And then the image to the right shows that since this Mahabharata is, I think, the largest myth humanity has produced so far, it was even alluded to that Vyasa, the supposed compiler or author or storyteller of this myth, which he was also a character that appears in the myth. So Plato, take a hint. This guy can be a master, a storyteller, and a composer, and also be a major character. And so he dictates to the god Ganesh to write down traditionally to write down the Mahabharata. So Mahabharata and Ramayana in a nutshell. Ask me anything.
Yeah, I'll give a chance to others. Graham, any questions to... I think you're familiar with a bunch of it as well, aren't you?
Yeah, no, it's like I've done a fair amount of research into these two, and again, I don't have any argument with anything Rogério has to say. I think he summed it up pretty good. one of the, again, I'm getting a bit kind of far afield, is one of the higher level parallels I'm noticing there seems to be a Diva Asura split happening again with with the Pandavas and the others,
Kuruvas.
the Kuruvas, yeah. That seems to
Yep.
be what you had on the divine level, you're now seeing on the human level there.
Yeah.
And,
Yep.
you know,
So, as above, so below. And
exactly.
it has a lot of psychological significance. They show that the Pandavas who were raised in nature, in the forest and mountains, and lived a humble life and full of adversity, they already were born excellently. Like there's a story of Bhima falling down a cliff while he was a baby, and his father panicked. Pandu panicked and went down the cliff, and the baby was fine. And there was just a rock that got smashed by the baby when he fell. So, yeah, it kind of showcases how awesome of superheroes they are. And to top that up, Bhima was even poisoned by the conniving one of the conniving Kuruvas. He just fell asleep like honey badgers do, and he floated down the Ganges River or Ganges River, like they call it. Ended up in the Nagas domain. Basically, he teleported to the domain of the Nagas, which are the snake people. Kind of seemingly like the serpentines in the Ninjago universe, and they beat him with their poisonous fangs, and the poison was actually the antidote to the initial poison that the conniving humans had gave him. So the poison of nature kind of counters the poison of humankind, and it balanced out, and the guy woke up immediately, overpowered the snakes that were attacking him, and then the Lord of the Snakes thought that the guy was so excellent that he presented him with a bunch of pots of this nectar of the gods. That one pot, just drinking one pot, this made me think about Obelix a lot. Because these pots give you the strength of 1,000 elephants each pot, and the guy drank 8 pots, making him the Obelix before Obelix, which I found really amusing. So the guy is over the top strong throughout the entire story, the archetypal strong guy, like Hulk or something like that.
Popeye.
Yeah, or Popeye. Yeah.
8
Yeah.
cans of spinach. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, they have a lot of
speaks-
really interesting passages that, if you think about them, it really seems that they're trying to impart a story that speaks about human nature.
Well, it's Samsonite too, right? It's Popeye. It's the idea of there's a brute ogre-like strength to dominate and Mephistopheles. That's the bad guy. But then there's this other type of strength that comes from a source, right? It's like you've got the 8 pots or the spinach with Popeye or something. So it's that kind of a strength. This character is getting his ability to fight the monsters that look impossible to defeat. Nature and disease and all of these things are too much. Well, humanity has access to something that can empower it. The story's saying at least something in that direction. I don't know. The story is fascinating. I want you to tell it from the beginning again, because I was taking too many notes. And
it's in a sense similar, this story between Bhima and the snakes, the Nagas. It kind of also reminds me about Apollo and the Python, because Apollo overcame the Python, and he gained, in a sense, the powers of the Python.
Well, the medical symbol has the snakes in a double helix wrapped around. It's like there's something about what kills you and terrifies you and makes you look away, that if you looked at it, you could figure it out and you would get the powers of that thing, right? All of medicine is figuring out what the plants do, the various plants for good and ill. Well, when you don't know any of that, you're the victim of whatever you come across. But when you do know it, you've invented medicine, right? anyway, it's exactly that. And this foundational myth is usually one of the first stories that gets told in any culture, where as our genius ancestors are trying to figure out, okay, how do we live in a world that's habitable and good? The first thing is, well, we better start looking at the snakes instead of away from them, right? That's the Marduk story. That's the Apollo and Python story, right? It's like the first story in most of these successful cultures is, you're a terrified ape who's afraid to look at the snake. Look at the damn snake. The answer, the gold is hidden by the dragon. That's where you get the gold that you need to make a city of gold where everybody's thriving. Something like that is usually the first story.
And the thing is, not every time, not all of the times, the snake is in the outer world. Sometimes it is in the inner world. For instance,
the snake is right in the garden. You're not building a wall that gets rid of it. The snakes are coming. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Nerdalliun mentioned that some people, they really have problematic. They really have mental conditions, severe mental conditions at times, and part of the potential yield or beneficial yield of us looking within us and examining us, kind of like Socrates was alluding to, is also to by gaining knowledge of our inner selves, we can know how are we crooked inwardly. If we really gain a grasp of how we are crooked inwardly, and probably everyone is crooked in some way, we should never be pretentious about being so straight in terms of our psychology, because I think that either we are a god or a sage, or there's something crooked within us, and there's always work to do. It's like a house under construction. That is our house. When we buy a house, we feel that there's always stuff to do, even if it's just maintenance. But we always kind of feel like we can do some upgrades in every time if we examine our house and how we use it. And I think our brain / mind is pretty much the same thing. If we kind of examine it like these sages are urging us to do, in a sense, exhorting us to do even, not just kind of hinting at it, they're really driving it, they're really hammering the nail. Then by gaining a bit more self-knowledge, this self-knowledge in itself might be transformative. At least by foray in different traditions of philosophy, from the Greco-Hellenistic, the Sufis, and also India and China. They were overlapping on this point, the point of developing self-knowledge, and this self-knowledge being a kind of an engine of self-development. Okay, I'll shut up. Go ahead, guys.
No, what you're saying is always the next story. So after you slay the dragon, the next story is there's some snakes in you that are actually more important, right? So you get Cain and Abel after you deal with the snake in the garden. You get Daphne and Apollo right after you get Python and Apollo, right? It's like, okay, you're starting to solve this thing. Don't think that it's a simple set of rules, and because dealing with the chaos is a simple set of rules. You cut the chaos into pieces. You can collect the data until you make sense out of it, and then you've got the power of the thing that used to prey upon you. But life isn't that. There's a higher principle than that, and that's where you get into, well, let's do ethics. The other thing I want to say is, while we're trying to extract propositional statements out of this art, I want to affirm that the proper domain of settling propositional truth is with the philosophers, right? So the rules of right reason in philosophy, the arguments we could have that's the final, just like if we have an idea that we think we know something about the empirical world, well, the scientists are the final arbiters of whether or not we're correct. We're not saying, okay, let's just stare at art and never do philosophy. What we're saying is, let's try to get the deep meaning out of the art. And then when we think we've understood it, we have to subject that to logic and ethics and the rules of right reason, because that's the proper domain for determining if your propositional ideas are actually correct, or if you've misunderstood the story, or if it was a bad story or something like that.
Look at it this way. We have a feeling for what is true or what is not in a sense. Sometimes we resonate with stuff a bit better. But until we enrich our vocabulary and also draw from different sources of learning, be it texts, gurus, sages, and even our life experience, there are some truths about human nature, for instance, that we cannot put into words. But then when I, at least I experienced this after I've delved in different traditions and I read like the Mahabharata, as I've been wrestling with this week, and I only scratched the surface. I read like 6 or 7 chapters out of the 85 chapters, and it took me the entire week basically. I could not resist to do some exegesis of the material, kind of putting into words what they seem to be aiming for, what they are trying, the kind of wisdom that the whoever was declaiming this orally for who knows what, how many, what amount of centuries, and then it was committed to writing, supposedly firstly in Sanskrit. But it seems like either they were non-intentionally including wisdom here, some wisdom, or they were intentionally smuggling wisdom with a nice story, since they knew that the story was nice, and they knew that the culture would absorb it with glee, with wanting. They knew that they would also, the culture, the people that had no intentions to develop philosophically, much less in any of the branches of philosophy, ethics, whatnot. They would still get the benefit from these kinds of pieces of timeless wisdom. Okay.
So what did you find? What did you find when you did that?
So, well, by the setup of the story, the comparison between the 5 Pandavas and the 100 Kauravas, the story is doing a contrast between the more contemplative life that the Pandavas led, the more self-restrained, self-disciplined life, the life that has some chance for delivering individual excellence, and it really does in the story, spectacularly, over the top. Maybe it only needs some nice Bollywood physics, impossible physics, to portray this over the topness, just as it deserves. And on the other side, the other guys that are more concerned with pleasures, with greed, they have manifest a lot of greed. They're always scheming. They are liars. They are conspiring all with each other because they are envious of the excellence of these 5 guys. But they never consider what these 5 guys went through to even become more excellent, to perfect their excellence. These Kauravas, they could take that hint, but they won't, because they're too focused on the material world. They hardly, if at all, look inwardly to figure themselves out, and rather they are actually, as has been portrayed by Plato's Socrates, they're kind of slaves of their vices. They're slaves of their character traits, unexamined character traits rather. And so, and I would say as well, neither one extreme or the other seems the best choice. The Pandavas often are showcased as having aloofness and naivety, and even they are kind of fooled by the Kauravas, at least initially, because they kind of, they only know their own selves, and their own selves are excellent. They don't they aren't like very knowledgeable about the more Machiavellian kind of part of the human soul, since they're only the higher notes of their soul, so to speak, have been playing most of the time. They are kind of illiterate regarding the more wretched kind of the human psychology, and while the other ones, well, they are wretched on their own sense, but at least they keep the cities running and whatnot. They, at least as tyrants, relatively, and they also develop huge social networks. They are very they are influencers basically. So I'd say that this story is giving us a hint to figure out the excesses committed by both sides. Even the Kauravas have some redeeming qualities, although the Mahabharata is screaming that they are evil. But I'd say that it's a mistake to completely sweep under the rug or pretend that these character traits espoused by the Kauravas don't exist within us. I think that every single one of us is prone to fits of rage and anger that can make us dangerous. We can be a liability to our fellow human beings. And if we know ourselves a bit better, maybe we can reduce that liability to others. So, okay, taking out.
It's interesting because you're describing two extremes. One that's too perfect, right? I mean, you know yourself, but there's not much to know, right? And then this other one that's all domination and materialism, and you know basically nothing except fight on this principle of power or something like that, and you're a slave, as Socrates would point out. Luckily, we existed in the mean between the two, right? So if you know what the extremes are, it's kind of hell to live in either one. I always think about how the Christians, when they talk about their version of heaven, it seems hellish to me. It seems just so pointless and dull in a sense. But luckily, there's a different conception of heaven, which is like the perfect harmony of like, okay, I've got some snakes. My self-knowledge, it came out in what you were talking about earlier, which is like, okay, this side knows nothing about the path that the other side has taken. It's like, well, what's that path? Well, it's the loneliest path of Zarathustra. It's the phoenix path. It's the burn everything about you that can burn so that you can rebuild out of that which doesn't burn, right? Something more eternal. But to get to that point, a lot of you burns away. And you're, so anyway, I guess I'm saying I like being in the mean between the two and saying, okay, we got some snakes to burn. Let's figure out what they are. But that gives me knowledge of the world that could be useful. I don't know. How does that strike you? Anyway, that's what I thought when you were talking.
Any thoughts, guys?
I was gonna say, yeah. Let me unload some of the stuff I've had building up here. One of them is that whole hero / sky god versus serpent is a huge recurring theme across cultures. You also have, Hercules and the Hydra. You have Zeus and Typhon. You have Yahweh and Leviathan in the Bible. And getting back to the, two works under question here. Interesting point of fact is Krishna city of Dwarpa, they have found ruins off the coast of India that are like 50 feet underwater or so, that looks to be that city and dates to be about that time period. And as far as the Ramayana goes, Ravana is a particularly interesting character above and beyond his role in this text, because he's kind of one-dimensional in the Ramayana, and he's much more complex, like Loki, where sometimes he actually plays a beneficial good role at times in different stories. Just going to the last one I wanted to say is some of the point of the extremes of the so good that it's a flaw, and even the bad ones have something redeeming. That's something that's designed to communicate with the average listener, the Joe Blow listening to it, because they sit there and they see these superpowered beings that can do all these things that they don't, yet that produces flaws that they don't suffer from. And they can sit there and go, it's like, yeah, I'm not as bad as the really bad guys, even though, and with the bad guys having a flaw, it's like, well, there's something redeemable about them. And that's also something we see in the whole Greek myths and the whole Greek theater time period, which is interestingly coinciding with similar times when these were actually written down. Just going to tag after my rant.
I just want to say I think that's right. And I think that that's a part of the characterological. When they speak in narrative, it's characterological. Well, the characters are yin and yang and yang and yin. They're not good guys and they're not bad guys. They're guys that exist. You need to know who they are. They're good for some things. They're bad in some places, right? They relate to this other deity well here. They shouldn't be in charge of this over here. So the one story makes them look bad and the other story makes them look good. How can that be? Just like life. We're characters. We're good for certain things. We're bad for other things. And the Zeus principle is everything needs to be in its proper place so that there's a harmony in the pantheon, something like that. But that's one of the things that some of my friends struggled with when we started talking about this. Like, wait a minute, is this guy a good guy or a bad guy? No, he exists. He's out there. He has a will. He has skills. He has problems. He has blind spots. Get to know his character, and you'll know what he's good for, and you'll navigate a world where you have to relate to these other personalities. And I think that's right.
I also have the more technical kind of texts that are not consisting only of nice stories here afterwards. But feel free to add something, Nerdalliun, or comment or ask a question. You seem more contemplative, more quiet.
Yeah, I know that there's a lot of different ideas floating around, and I've been thinking about some of my own stuff. And yeah, it's difficult to decide what to talk about. So I'll maybe share some of the thoughts I've been thinking about while you guys were talking. Like I mentioned earlier, I've been interested in decision history, and something that gets tucked away a little bit in a corner of decision making is just the value of stories to really support people making better decisions and how that works. And that's something I'm quite interested to unpack. It's definitely a thing in modern decision science. So I think one of the modern incarnations would be the critical incident method, where experts come around and they tell stories of critical incidents where they had to make really high stakes decisions really quickly, and where that worked and where it didn't work. And it's a formal method of organizational knowledge management and expert mentoring, where experts teach apprentices how to make better decisions, these really high stake decisions. And it's really useful because it sort of compresses time. So the experts may have been around for 30 or 40 years in the same job, and they get asked to reflect the most important decisions they made in that 40 years. So maybe they talk about the 10 critical incidents that came up, and they get to sort of teach the lessons that they learned in those 40 years in a period over a couple of months. And it may take another couple of months for the apprentices to really internalize a significant portion of that. Probably never will be all of it. But I think, yeah, that's a formal thing that organizations these days still do. And I think maybe some of these myths and stories have a similar function among other functions. I think it's maybe a little tempting to decree what one sole purpose of a story is in people's lives, but I think different people get different kinds of values out of stories. Just like Zara was saying, different characters can be good for some things here and not so good for other things there. I think stories similarly have a multi-dimensional aspect to them. I think of value in a fairly multi-dimensional way. Anyway, so I'm in the decision history on study that I've been doing. I'm trying to figure out how to include the ancient Mesopotamian stories and how they may have been served to improve the community's decision making. And I'm glad we're going through the Indian stories as well. So I'm kind of thinking, what about these stories? I can say, how do they influence decisions and how do they support better decision making? Something I noticed while going through Peterson's materials, Peter Adamson's materials, is the Vedas, the early texts. Put a lot of emphasis on.
Show the slide here.
Yes, so just they're complicated texts, and I haven't read them. But one of the things that stood out to me as similar to some of the ancient Mesopotamian stories is the great emphasis on sacrifice, and something that strikes me as maybe different from contemporary culture is the expectation that not only commoners come sacrifice their dues to the temple, but also the kings and the priests sacrifice there, and they make a public display. They make a public ritual, a public ceremony, where the kings will also sacrifice some of their animals, some of their wealth to the gods. And just knowing how deeply imitative people are, I think that's quite an important thing for leaders to show followers. Look, I am also willing to sacrifice some of my well-being, some of my wealth, for the sake of the community, for the communal gods. I'm not just taking from you. So you sacrifice your little piece because that's your job in the ceremony. I sacrifice my little piece, and we all work together to to please the gods, or maybe in more secular terms, to serve the community, something like that. And yeah, I think generally stories can be very powerful aids to decision making in providing role models to imitate, and just reflecting on the role stories play in my own decision making. I would often sort of tell stories about what's going on in my life. So if I make decisions about who to continue working with, who to rather avoid working with in the future, I'll often tell stories about what happened, and I'll try to frame whatever happened, interpersonal situations happened, in different ways, or try to write different stories, different versions of that story, until I find a story that seems to be a nice, concise summary of the interaction that happened, and sort of conceive of myself as a character in that story, try to tell the story in a third-person way, and then ask myself, if I was viewing this story from the outside, what would my advice be to my character to take a wise choice? Or is there some other character that I know would have behaved in a wise way, and what way would they have behaved? So this kind of thinking of decision as in the context of a narrative, of a life narrative, and then deciding what to do based on imitating the wisest person that you know, or the wisest character that you know, in a similar kind of story context, is a potent way to, and a very naturalistic way, and I think that's a way that will come very easily to lots of people. It's a very different form of decision support than, say, decision analysis, where probabilities and value functions and utility functions are dealt with mathematically. But I still think the point of decision support is to improve decision making, and I think stories can be used to improve decision making, and mathematics can be used, and mathematics can mislead people, and stories can also mislead people. So it's not whether it's a story or whether it's mathematics that makes it good or bad. It's like kind of the way it gets used, and like how wisely it gets put to use. Anyway, those are some of the thoughts I was thinking. I would have actually liked to be more familiar with, say, the Indian stories. I just sadly probably won't be all that familiar ever with them, at least in the foreseeable future, because there's the Lion King song goes, there's more to see than can ever be seen, and more to do than can ever be done.
If I may, there is a 2-hour-long anime movie on Ramayana that I'm even trying to collaborate with the creators, the Japanese creators, that they collaborated with expert scriptwriters from India. They created a really nice anime film, and it's freely available in a lower resolution on YouTube. And the 4K remaster, they're trying to do screenplays of it, but I can link you to it. It's only going to take you like 2 hours out of your life, and it gives you the basic gist of the Ramayana without the supposed filler content, because although these stories have really intense set piece moments, like in the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita is like your heart rate is just like 80 throughout the entire setup, and then you reach the Bhagavad Gita, and Krishna suddenly becomes the time and the destroyer of worlds, and he's speaking from all sides around Arjuna, and suddenly you're like, whoa, what the hell, man, what the hell, you're overwhelmed. Also, you kind of feel that overwhelming that Arjuna is also feeling. And I imagine at the time people listening to the story for the first time, they'll probably their hairs probably stand on end, and their heart rates rose and whatnot. It was an experience probably. And also, to tie into what you just said, Nerdalliun, I'm wondering if when you try to decide things, you both include the kind of analytical propositional weighing of things, like this person has this character trait or this skill that I value a lot, and also this person is aspiring to this kind of ideal that I also value, but they have this and this vice which I do not value, propositionally, basically. And then do you also weigh in how certain stories that you shared with them, of your interaction with them, how they made you feel, basically? Do you weigh both things equally? Do you weigh the propositional, the more analytical part more, or the more emotional part more, or it depends on the circumstance? I'm wondering about that.
Yeah, I consider both of them. Which one is more important depends on the circumstance. So if I can see a pattern in the interaction between us, and this may not even be necessarily a matter of vices or virtues. It may just be a difference that in a dynamic, I can spot, oh, very likely I'm going to get very cross in interactions with this person regularly in a way that might be counterproductive. That may be a fairly strong reason to decide there are better people to work with than this person. And it could be that neither of us are bad people because of that. It just could be a mismatch of personalities and priorities. Sometimes I think, like when I consider people, I notice their souls aren't perfectly crooked. They're not gods. So I sort of spot some of the cracks. I know I myself am crooked and I have a bunch of cracks, and it often takes a while for me to, before I become grateful for other people to show me my cracks that I wasn't aware of, but I eventually usually prefer knowing about them than to be in the dark about them. So if sometimes the emotions themselves, like the anger or the anxiety, like negative emotions, can be an overwhelming reason to decide not to collaborate with someone. But at other times, I may become irritated or annoyed with people in ways that are kind of unreasonable. Like sometimes if I haven't eaten in a long time and I'm sort of low on sleep or stuff, I can get a little grumpy. And just being a little grumpy at like insignificant little faux pas from people is not reasonable. So at that time, I'll try to so I'll reason through it, and if the reason sort of points to my emotions being unreasonable, I'll try to downplay the emotions and try emotional regulation strategies to bring my emotions in line with reason when they're but like I said, sometimes the emotions themselves can constitute quite strong reasons, so it varies on context. I've only really been paying attention to feelings as you might become aware of them if you do like a body scan meditation since like a year ago. I mostly didn't care too much for that because it's noisy data. Like if I do a body scan now, the overwhelming feeling is lower back pain from the position I'm seated in, and also some stiffness in my muscles from exercising, and the relevance to our conversations almost none. So I got away not paying attention to my body most of the time. Sometimes there's quite relevant information, so it's sometimes it and anyway, I won't go off on a tangent on how body scans can and can't be useful, but yeah, since recently I've sort of included body scans among the things I take into consideration. But a lot of the things I take into consideration would involve something like abstract goals. So do something like a stakeholder analysis and think through the ends that people are after, and to see if those ends align and if there can be collaboration towards those ends. I would say that's probably the most influential, and one of the decision frameworks that really emphasizes that is a framework called value-focused thinking, although it's an idea that comes up in many places. The analyst that wrote a book called Value-Focused Thinking, his name is Ralph Keeney, and he really reckons that people can get hung up about alternatives, courses of actions, and they can also get hung up about the consequences and probabilistic models of what will happen if we do this, what will happen if we do, and they neglect making a careful analysis of what it is that they actually want, like what are the values that they're trying to pursue. So making a decent analysis and a decent list of the values that different people are trying to pursue is usually my starting point and often my ending point. If the values seem to be fundamentally in conflict, try find ways to avoid that conflict, see if we can let live, and if there's some overlap and we sort of pursuing the same values, try to find ways in which we can work together synergistically and complement each other. Sorry, that was a lot about me. Probably.
Yeah, but thanks. I think all of us.
Really good.
I think all of us can gain much from these so-called philosophies of ways of living, and also the mythopoetic baggage that's usually attached to them. Funnily enough, because I really do think that aphoristic thinking re-engineers our mind. If one of us reads Marcus Aurelius, some of the aphorisms he's put up there, even though they might not be literally true, they might be kind of exaggerations of an ideal. If you tell yourself these with some regularity, it will kind of re-engineer your thinking, and this is of course a part of active metacognition, I'd say. It's being your own teacher, being your own master, kind of figuring out that your mind is a bit like a garden, and as gardens do, weeds can grow there, and beasts that have no business being there can um, um, go through the enclosure or fence or whatnot and do some damage in there. And if we do assume the role of a faithful garden, but we need tools, we aren't much of a gardener if we don't have any of these tools. And I think we've been picking up a few tools, tools made up of metaphysics, so thought technology, basically, not really technology of atoms. So I think there's huge potential, maybe even in a sense that the art of self-improvement and the art of living never reaches a limit in our lifetimes. We can always do some more improvements, even if we are not kind of like a wretched, depressed, anxious human being that we want to avoid being at all costs. Even if we're doing okay during most of our day, and maybe even experiencing some of that sweet eudaimonia, as the Greeks would say, or shanti, as the Hindus would say, there's always room for improvement, because eudaimonia or shanti are like quantities that probably cannot have any bounded limit. It's like the part of us that is fluctuating is like the surface of the ocean, and if we are close to the coast and the sea is agitated, the ocean might recede and wave up over the coast, while in the deep ocean it's like the temporary pleasures or the temporary happiness is the surface of the ocean. And even if a storm is raging, the depths of the ocean are still there, and won't uncover the bottom of the ocean. And so I think this metaphor has some merit, as I have, at least anecdotally, I've been feeling much more at peace with myself, even with the same kind of adversity from unsavory so-called personalities I deal with in my 9 to 5. Since I cannot control them or manipulate them, I just accept them. They are as they are, and they do what they do. But I need to do what I need to do regardless. So yeah, I think we should move on.
Well, wait. I'm gonna beg us not to quite yet. First of all, what you said, Rogério, that's right. I think the reason why you never get to the end is for the same reason why you never say I fully know and can't be surprised by my spouse anymore. It's an ongoing relationship. You're relating to the good, and so, but that was wonderful. But Nerdalliun, it was a pleasure to meet you today. Now it's much more of a pleasure. I know how deeply more of a pleasure it is. I am absolutely fascinated by this idea of stories playing a role in decision making. And if you guys could just, if you'll allow me, I'd like to repeat back what I've heard and ask a couple questions to probe a little bit on this, because I think it's really profound. Would you guys mind if we do that really quickly?
Yeah, sure.
All right. I've never thought of this before. It looks like a shrug. Would you rather we move on instead? We can do that instead. Maybe we'll talk about it some other time, but I think this is really powerful, and I've never thought of it before. And I like the way you described it. So if you want to just move on, let's just move on. But I'd love to talk to you more about this some other time then.
Yeah, we usually try to keep these streams to no longer than 3 hours, and I believe we still got a lot of Indian.
Okay,
to
fantastic.
Yeah, let's go through
that. That does sound like that would be very appropriate for your decision science stream, discussion though.
Let's move on. I'd love to ask you about that some other time. That's really fascinating.
Okay, so moving on to the other texts, we have the Upanishads. There are hundreds of them, and they are kind of like the Platonic dialogues in a sense, but from multiple authors and from multiple time periods. I think most of them are BC, or BCE rather, and as the supposed meaning of the word Upanishad means sitting by a master. There is a guru teaching a disciple, and to the right is one of the quintessential Upanishads, where this Brahman kid learns about life, the universe, and everything from Yama, which is a really fun read. And Yama kind of gives him a similar visual metaphor of the self as the chariots given by Plato as well in the Phaedrus, with a few differences, to be sure. So there might be some convergent thinking here, and not a kind of mystical passage of information from one mind to the other across a long distance. But regardless, it has very interesting metaphysical propositions about the nature of self, of choosing what is appropriate consistently, instead of choosing what just feels good to the senses. That might feel nice now, but it will build up, and you'll reap undesirable, disturbing consequences later on. Which is a theme that is explored in many different cultures, where this idea of choosing what is bitter, especially at first, is the way to go, instead of getting mired and uh, getting stumped by this futile and ephemeral happiness of indulging the senses, either just with entertainment or vices or whatnot. This is also famously a theme mentioned in Xenophon's story of the choice of Hercules, where Hercules chooses between basically vice and virtue. Okay, so, and many more themes in the Upanishads. There are Upanishads that talk about atomism, the elements making up the universe. So really cosmological and philosophical hard things, of hard science of that time period. Others are completely atheistic, rejecting of God. So there's a huge diversity in what is called Upanishads. Feel free to add anything, questions, and whatnot.
Again, I'm not deeply familiar with any of the Upanishads, and yeah, I don't think in the first 3 episodes Adamson goes in any depth in any of them. In fact, the first 3 episodes seem like a bit of a bewildering
whirlwind tour,
World War tour, whirlwind tour of Indian thought, and there are like many words that I'm unfamiliar with and many names, so it felt a little overwhelming. But something I can sort of focus in, like just as a takeaway, is just the dates and the order of things, and it's also just worth keeping in mind that a joke that Adamson makes is there are more uncertain dates than at a junior school dance. So these dates aren't exactly pinned down with any precision.
Yeah.
But the fact that the guesses for the Upanishads are around 700 to 500 BCE makes it reasonable to think that maybe the Upanishads influenced Siddhartha's thinking. It's less reasonable to expect the other influence in the other direction. Similarly with, I guess, the earlier Vedas. So the earlier Vedas probably influenced the Upanishads, or in some way influence it, not necessarily to say the Upanishads just agree with the earlier Vedas. In fact, the Indians seem to enjoy disagreeing with each other as much as anyone else on the planet enjoyed disagreeing. But yeah, it also reminded me of a thing that sort of irks me a little bit about some modern interpretations of Buddhism as sort of taking on face value as literally true the idea that the Buddha was a very ignorant and naive person up until he left the palace, and then in sort of a couple of years of asceticism in some versions, or in less enlightened versions, like within a couple of days under a tree or something, his meditation practice revealed divine wisdom to him, like out of thin air. I think just realistically, that's quite unlikely. Much more likely was that he was deeply enculturated in these kinds of stories, the Upanishads and the Vedas that came before him, and a lot of his thinking was probably in response to that, and as it turned out, criticisms and sort of denial of some of the stuff that happens, but definitely not naive and uninformed, definitely informed by earlier things.
I can see that happening personally. I read a bunch of stuff during months or years. I sit down and try to not have any thoughts in meditation, basically. I have thoughts, all the same, and it's kind of like my mind trying to syncretize or synthesize things. And I see that they don't come from anywhere. They come from something, and these things jiggle until they kind of overlap or fit like puzzle pieces. And I think that was what happened with Siddhartha. But cool story, bro. That's a cool story. That's a really cool story. Like a story so cool that it gives basically backs the it gives backing to the authority, basically, which is a huge trope in these kinds of stories, of kind of prophetic stories. The story behind the prophet is really very impressive and gives them credibility.
Yeah, and it goes back and forth a little bit. So, like a story about this like really magical revelation of the Buddha sort of gives weight to what the Buddha said, and then later authors can come up with things and they can attribute it to the Buddha, and the Buddha gives weight to what they're saying. So I think the first time Buddhist texts were written down was almost 400 years after the Buddha died. So I think there are like two things happen. First of all, the Buddha's own teaching, probably deeply informed by teachings that came before him, and also the version of Buddhism's, the several versions of Buddhism we get that are also in conflict with each other, that we get, are influenced by hundreds of years of thinking after the Buddha died also, and people attributing their thoughts to Buddha in order to give their thoughts more authority, because he was this very famous prince who magically got enlightened, and if an enlightened person says so, then it must be so, isn't it? That kind of vibe. So yeah,
but
so
it's
Buddhism,
strange. It's strange. It's strange because at the same time there was one of the most famous bits of text attributed to him. To be sure, it's only attributed, pretty much like stuff is attributed to Hippocrates, that tells us to not give ourselves to any doctrine or even sage, whatever he may be, even not excluding himself, the Buddha, which is kind of like a tour de force on skepticism. And it kind of explains Pyrrho later on, who seemingly was influenced by these guys. So we can just dismiss Buddha and figure out things for ourselves, I think.
Yeah, I was going to sit here and chime in with, I think your problem here, Nerdalliun, if you've never had that personal experience of going to a weekend retreat and having all the secrets of the universe revealed to you after some meditation sessions. So, since they have and you don't, you just can't understand their position on that one. No, in all seriousness, I see the Upanishads. It is serious that's probably their attitude about it. But the Upanishads I see as a reaction to the rise in writing and the spread of literacy, because it's basically they're describing it as sitting with a master, and that's sort of like what basically now that you have writing, you could read this instead of having to sit at the master and listen instead. And I think that's the idea of where this was coming from. I'm going to tag on those.
Zara, do you want to put into words what you were
no
bring out from these paintings? Because
I'm conscious.
You have
I'm
artistic X-ray vision, basically.
I'm conscious of the time. I just wrote it in notes or in a comment or something. I was just
Yeah.
noticing something about the painting, but I don't want to slow us up, which is why I started writing it instead of taking up all the time with this art
Awesome.
obsession
Thanks.
of mine. So yeah, let's. I'll leave it in the comments under the YouTube.
I'll share with you guys the comparison that Adamson and Janardhan drew between the two skeptics, the two uber skeptics of West and East. So Sextus Empiricus, heavyweight coming from the West, this intellectual descendant of Pyrrho, who arguably drew from naked sages, whoever they might be from India. And then there is Nagarjuna, who maybe even lived at the same time as Sextus Empiricus, and possibly an intellectual descendant of the Eastern teachers of Pyrrho. And they were really interesting the way they wrote, because as Adamson mentioned, they were very conscious of the apparent flaws of their propositions, of their thesis, and they wrote their thesis by foreseeing arguments against them and writing these arguments really clearly and vividly to try to dismount their own ideas. Also, pretty much like Plato seemed to do as well, using characters in dialectic. And so Nagarjuna would say, well, nothing actually exists on itself because everything is so interdependent. And so nothing really is. It's all interdependent. Nothing really is apart from everything else. And then he would wonder if his own statement would stand on its own feet by contradicting itself or not. And so, yeah, I thought this a really interesting tour de force in skepticism on both sides. Okay, taking out and yeah, let you guys comment or disagree with me. Feel free to disagree with me.
It's Alan Bloom pointed out that it's a sign of real genius to be able to apply your own method to your own thinking. He distinguished Karl Marx and Freud. He said they've got this model for understanding the world. Freud, it's all subconscious sexual desire you don't want to be honest about, and for Marx, it's all class warfare, something like that. He says, except for their books are not the product of subconscious sexual desire. Their ideas are not the product of class warfare. Those are science and truth. And he said those are lesser. They're in a lesser category than someone like Nietzsche, who could say everything is will to power, including my book, which we shouldn't talk about that because people misunderstand will to power. But his understanding of the idea that everything is the desire to shine and make oneself felt in the world in a way that helps contribute to the ongoing creation, which is a better way of describing will to power. But the point is, his model, he could then apply it to his book and he could apply it to himself. And so I thought of that when you're talking about Nagarjuna is saying, okay, there's nothing that is except that it's being felt by other things. It's true that it manifests in the world, and those manifestations are its relationships to other things. And then to take that and say, wait a minute, do I have the ultimate truth? Because if I do, it should be true about my statement itself, is what Alan Bloom would have identified as the mark of the higher level genius, to be able to do that. So anyway, I thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, I think Peter Adamson will come back to Nagarjuna in a later part of the course. So in the context he was talking about Nagarjuna, it was just to give an example of an Indian thinker who was engaging in activity that to his eyes just straightforwardly a philosophical activity, even though he was a Buddhist monk. So philosophy coming out of a quarter you might not expect it, although I don't know why you would not expect it to come out of a monk, because Christian monks have produced a lot of philosophy throughout the ages. But yeah, so I think I don't know much about Nagarjuna, and I don't really know the interpretation of what he meant. It was something like everything is empty, and then he sort of anticipates an opponent saying, well, how about that statement? Is that empty too? And I think he kind of says it's in a way it's empty, but in a way he's not making a statement like you would usually make a statement. It's I forget. He has a very creative analogy for a magical being undoing another magical being is what he's trying to do by saying that. He's not making a statement about the world. So he's performing some kind of spell by uttering those words rather than making analytical observation of facts. So he's saying just that whole.
Maybe it means that he's delving in metaphysics, and so it's fantasy creature land. In metaphysics, we can say anything we want, but the main point is it needs to be self-consistent in metaphysics. Otherwise, we can do anything. It's like the putty of the philosophers. But well, I'm not sure if he overcame his inner conflicts of skepticism.
Yeah, so the way Peterson just summarizes that argument is there's a skeptic who's arguing against a realist, and the realist basically accuses the skeptic of self-refuting or self-contradiction, and he defends himself using metaphysics and a creative answer to the realist objection. And that whole process of back and forth argumentation, that kind of argumentation, Adamson reckons that's just plain straightforward philosophy being done there. And so it's an example of a philosopher doing philosophy, whether we agree with it or not, or like is kind of beside the point. It should be included in a history of philosophy that doesn't have any gaps.
Also, there's the point that, Peter Adamson mentions that there's a big chunk of Western philosophy that's influenced by the East. I'm not sure how things went the other way around, if the West actually influenced India or not. Maybe, because Alexander, after all, went up to India, and there's still architecture and sculptures that are a mix or a blend of Greco and Hindu art styles. But so I thought that a meme about this is in order as well. Also, there's a lot of this charitable love in Stoicism and also Christianity. Christianity was born in Judaism, the land of these guys that only cared about the Judaic covenant, and didn't manifest a lot of charitable love in the Old Testament, as you guys might have a feeling for. And so this really alien ethical concept arrived embodied in Jesus Christ, who we don't know for sure, but he might have also learned from the East, like these other guys that perhaps learned from the East as well. But I thought it's interesting because although we will probably never know for sure unless we have a time machine, it seems plausible that there have been these ethical ideas that migrated from the Indus-Gangetic plain to Europe.
I was going to say, I don't think that's really fair to Socrates. I think his ignorance is pretty much not cribbed from Buddhism. I think he came up with that. I don't know anything. His whole gig was, going around and pointing out that all those people who claim they know something really know even less than him. So the other one I wanted to say is I do think that, at least my opinion, you can call the British having an impact on India as far as, Western culture, civilization having an impact on India. So going to tag on that one.
So moving on, he also alluded to the path in a nutshell of Nagarjuna's description of Buddhism. So firstly, radical skepticism to kind of burn away delusions or stuff that ain't true, that we might be either consciously or unconsciously holding dear to, and it's causing us to become obsessed with stuff that influences us through our senses, either positively or negatively, like fleeing from material wealth, because we we aren't we don't believe in ourselves to be capable of dealing with that, or lacking courage to talk to a stranger or something like that because we're too anxious. So these kinds of perturbations to our tranquility, they are real. We all experience them, but do we have the tools to minimize them, to deal with them? That is another question that I think is worthwhile, regardless of the tradition, regardless if it's Buddhism, Stoicism, Sufism, Confucianism, whatever. Do we really have the tools that the environment in which we live is calling for? Sometimes maybe not, and thus it's really useful to do a nice voyage through different traditions like the Ionians did, and we're literally doing so right now, looking at all these other traditions. I also think that what the Buddhists don't say is also very important, because the Buddhists don't say that when people are basically obsessed with the outer world and they are prone to vices and whatnot, they don't say how fulfilling it is, and I've also, at least in part, experienced this, to experience the tranquility and peace that comes with a well-ordered mind. Even though there's always work to do, I'm probably in a better place after the Stoics and Sufis and whatnot after these past 2 years. I'm probably in a better position mentally right now, and in terms of mental resilience right now, than I was before, because now I'm armed with a lot more tools to deal with stuff. And although we will people will feel feelings, it's gonna happen. We all feel, but at least if feelings are like garbage that accumulates outside of our home, at least there is a more regular garbage collection mechanism that kind of takes away the feelings in an expedite manner. And so even though we still keep being human beings, we didn't ascend to godhood or sagehood by any means. At least things are flowing a bit better, and we can go on with our lives by reacting to things with a more cold-headed in a sense, because we manage to find ways to process our feelings in a more expedite manner. So yeah, I thought this was worthy of mentioning, especially because I was basically in a Buddhist lecture yesterday. A guy was presenting his book, and his book was basically the story of Siddhartha, and he did touch upon the story, which is a nice story, but he also touched upon the fundamentals of Buddhism, which sprang a bit of questions from me, and the fact that he didn't kind of have rapport with me after the fact kind of seems that maybe I made some questions that he wasn't prepared to answer. So yeah, this is always interesting to see. Yeah. Okay. Should we move on? Do you guys want to comment on that?
Yeah, I want to make a real brief comment just on the previous slide. It's a really funny meme, the Western philosophy copying notes from Buddhism, but strictly speaking, that's not even true for pretty much all of Indian philosophy. So yeah, there's more to Indian philosophy than Buddhism.
Yeah. Man, there's a lot. I think even after these 20 sessions on Indian philosophy, we'll just be having a gist of it, because there is so much going on. And imagine like the ancient Greeks never went phased out due to the Romans and the Christianized Romans and the Ottomans and the Venetians and whatnot. They really got hammered down, smacked down from all sides throughout these centuries. If people had left them be and let them thrive, we would probably see a lot of interesting things. Like, I'll just show you really fast a really quick tour on temples in India. Please forgive my quickness on this. So Buddhist temple, 2,300 years. Another temple in honor of Shiva. Shiva himself, statues of Shiva all over the place. I'd say Shiva is the main worshipped god in India right now. A temple in the mountains in Kashmir region. That the main part of the temple is the cave that exists for at least 1 million years. Then still in the Himalayas, another temple to. So the previous one was to Malakshmi, etc., which are images of Vaishno Devi, so a goddess, and then river goddesses, goddess Yamuna, which is the same name of one of those rivers. Another one, goddess Ganga. You know the river. Also in the Himalayas. The third one of these four major temples in the Himalayas. So this one is dedicated to Vishnu, and established according to tradition by the Pandavas that you've heard from in the Mahabharata. And then this one is a temple dedicated to Vishnu. And since this temple was erected surrounded by Buddhist artisans and architects, it is pretty much in a Buddhist style, although it's a Hindu temple. Then to the south, we have these massive temples, step temples. This one dedicated to a form of Shakti and her consort, which is a form of Shiva. So basically, many gods in India, and they just assume, oh, this is a form of another god that previously existed, and we'll all get along. I think that's one thing that distinguished Hindu religion pretty starkly from more Western European tradition, where we just kicked the crap out of each other because we were worshipping the wrong god. And then another one dedicated also to Shiva, also in the south. Another one very similar to the other one a couple of slides ago, founded by this guru that I will show you, also dedicated to Shiva. This guru, I'll show you in a few slides. This one is dedicated to one of the earliest gods, the sun god. to the other one was to the east, and this one is to the west. And now completely from another religion, the religion of Sikhism, a temple that is golden. It's beautiful, and the lake is artificial around the temple. It's really beautiful. And then even more recent, roughly 200 years established, a woman that was childless due to infertility but wealthy because of agribusiness. She commissioned this temple in honor of Ganesh, so that Ganesh would not allow this fate to befall on other women, which I thought the sentiment is really profound, and it's noble, quite noble. And then, well, this guy Adi Shankara, that was mentioned by Peter Adams, and here he is with his disciples. He's one of the writers of the epic myths, and he published a bunch of verses of the Bhagavad Gita, probably verses that were added to the oldest myths. So these myths, the Bhagavad Gita, is kind of like an inflated kind of myth, and probably the reason for the inflation is so much text being added by these so-called inspired poets and sages. And yep, this is really a quick tour. So to give you guys a feel for what could have been of Greece if Greece hadn't been stifled. Probably there would be bigger and better temples, bigger and better statues, and etc.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's interesting.
Okay, so also the significance of what the guy has drawn on his head. It spells the Om syllable, which is supposedly it encapsulates the arche of the cosmos. The Om, and all it's filled with meaning. I won't go into these meanings, but the slide is here for people to examine. Also, the mudra that the guy is doing also has meaning to them. when we join the index finger and the thumb finger, it is like the encounter between the self and the cosmos. That's what it symbolizes. And they claim that this finger gesture that we maintain enhances concentration, use of the intellect. Well, I do it when I meditate at times to see if it has any effects. Maybe it does, because it kind of stresses the nervous system in a sense. So who knows if it has uh, scientifically findable benefits. Then I included also this this meme here. So also alluding to the our Cartesian post-Cartesian mind. So yeah, what's the difference? And this guy, this guru says, why do you show me two pictures of Brahman? All is Brahman, which I found funny. Okay, and after these slides, I also have a few excerpts from the texts, Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, actually. But feel free, guys, to comment on these. Otherwise, I can show you the other ones.
So Spinoza said that we have two languages available to us to describe the phenomena of the world, the objective and the subjective, right? Mind and matter. And Hegel said if we were ever able to unite those two languages in one, so that when we're saying something, it's both the subjective and the objective description of reality at one and the same time, he said that would be, he called that the end of history. There'd be nowhere else to go once we were able to synthesize those two. It's interesting. I'm just bringing this up as we talk about the dialectic between East and West. I mean, this Eastern perspective you're giving us seems to agree with that. It's the nirvana is the place where you wake up into the realization that the two are actually the same thing.
Well, I believe that there are things that we cannot put into words, because these things cognate within us, these things emote within us, make us experience things in our inner world. Due to lack of a dedicated science, at least in our contemporary existence, there are a lot of unknowns still. We might figure out ways to put them satisfactorily into words and statements and aphorisms if we keep going. Who knows what kind of developments there are still to do. I think it's worthwhile to keep pushing the envelope. And I really think that there is value in grasping at what is ineffable and it's non-verbal. It's non-verbal, but it's communicating with us. It's our kind of more animal side, more natural side that keeps on going. The so-called turtle mind, as opposed to the rabbit brain. The rabbit brain is all over the place, doing things fast, intellect crunching data and whatnot, while the turtle mind is kind of stepping back, looking at the whole picture and trying little by little to put the picture together, to make it have meaning, to make it have sense, even if the meaning cannot be put into words, but we kind of feel it, we kind of get it in a sense, or resonate with it. So I think that both modes of thinking have their merits, have their values. I think that there is danger in thinking that only one is the way. And I also think that there is also danger in going overboard on one of them.
Yeah, agreed. That goes back to what you were pointing. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Graham.
I was just going to chime in here and say that just give my necessary nod to Descartes' cogito, which bridges the gap between the objective and subjective domains. Just going to tag on that.
Agreed. That's what we're calling the consummate thinkers, the few thinkers in Western philosophy who seem to be able to do that, and Descartes is one of them. Yeah, so I'm not trying to make an argument about which language to use, right? And you're right, either one alone is insufficient. But what you were talking about earlier, where these holy philosophers, right? It's like they're doing both at the same time. They're synthesizing the religious, spiritual, prophetic insights with actual philosophy, with arguments and the organization of right thinking and the getting your ideas sorted out. They're doing both at the same time. You pointed out that there are Western philosophers who had to resort to narrative and mythopoetry to get at their ultimate truths as well. You talked about Plato using narrative and that sort of thing. And it almost seems like all of Indian philosophy is as far as the greatest Western philosophers ever got, right? Like Nietzsche and Plato, they're using literature not because it's just a fun thing to do, but because it's the necessary and appropriate vocabulary for getting at these truths that are sort of beyond just one of those two languages alone.
To add to that, there are some thoughts and some concepts that are so sophisticated and complex to grasp that you cannot put them into words or a single sentence. Sometimes an entire poem is called for to help yourself and others grasp it. And sometimes that poem is an entire epic, like the Ramayana or Mahabharata, which means that there is still tons of exegesis that can be done to these texts that can reveal really interesting interpretations that are not just for the kicks of it, but to try to give us more insights into human nature.
I think part of the reason why that is that, you know, when Socrates was about to drink the poison, he was talking with his friends, right, his students. And he basically said, look, we've been doing philosophy. We've really been doing philosophy. That's not untrue. We've been doing it. But what we've really been doing is trying to orient our souls properly towards the arche, the sun, the source of justice, so that we can, and he said it explicitly, we can relate to it properly, like get to know it in a relational sort of way, so that when we navigate the world, we'll see bits of truth and bits of beauty and bits of justice. And we'll say, oh, that's like this thing that I know on a personal level, right? So he's describing the ultimate knowledge as something relational. You know, this is why Nietzsche said Plato is Christianity is Plato for the masses, right? It sounds extremely religious what he's talking about. It's like listening to a Christian say, oh, Christ said, I am the truth, and you have to get to know him. Well, that's exactly what these great thinkers are saying. Socrates was saying it. Descartes said it in 2 paragraphs of his Meditations, that we're trying to get our ideas organized, not because the propositional truth we get to is the truth, but because it will get the misunderstandings out of the way so that we can directly meditate and relate to this source of knowledge and truth, the Brahma, the one thing behind it all. And what's interesting is it seems like all of Indian philosophers sort of understood that from the start. Is like, oh yeah, the greatest accomplishments of your entire culture, that's how we start the conversation over here or something. I don't know. That's what I'm picking up on from the fact that they seem to have this all figured out.
There's an important thing to mention, which is Vedic culture was heavily influenced by shamanic culture. They kept on using plants and herbs and altered states of consciousness. They kept on experimenting with altered states of consciousness, whether through plants or meditation or other things, which is by no means what science of tables and chairs and atoms and void is all about. It's completely pointing the magnifying glass inwardly instead of outwardly. And I truly think that we need to have James Webb Space Telescopes, but we also need to figure out how to make our mind into a clearer and more polished kind of thing, in homage to Spinoza as well, pointing it inward and making it, keeping it clear, so that we may have it pointed as a precision instrument of figuring out ourselves, and maybe even using as a focusing lens to burn something that we don't want there. in our minds. We want to excise it because it has been planted there by bullies at school or by manipulative people that slighted us at some point or another in our lives, and we still have that echoing within us, and we kind of might assume since it's there, it's us, it's part of us. But after further examination, like Socrates would love us to do, we might figure out that, well, this that I'm thinking right now, I'm not even voluntarily thinking it, since I have decided to sit down and just breathe and not voluntarily think anything. But this thought is arising spontaneously within me, and it's talking about pain and negative thoughts or whatnot. And it's not me. I know where it came from because I've examined it enough. And so by knowing where it came from, it's already at least half dispelled. It's half resolved by just you having figured it out. And this brings me to the emphasis of Indian philosophy. So Indian philosophy focuses on means to attain human flourishing, which is closer to the roots of European philosophy. All of the time we will be tempted to talk about Plato, Pythagoras, and Empedocles, and all these other guys that were much more mystics, much more inwardly focused, more contemplative. Even Aristotle was pretty much a lot contemplative with a lot of his ethical and metaphysical musings. So philosophy as a way of life. Philosophy primarily as a means to live better, to live more fulfilling and tranquil lives. Not so much a life dedicated to debauchery, binge drinking, binge watching Netflix, video games 20 hours straight or something like that. Much to the contrary, a life based on the little pleasures of life, to be sure, yes, to have enjoy a nice meal with good company, but not living for like exquisite dishes that will make us in the end reel from excess cholesterol or sugars in our blood, diabetes and whatnot. So really a healthy lifestyle, which is literally half of what yoga and Ayurveda is, with the introspective activity of these philosophies, and they don't just tell us, oh, look more inside. They don't just tell us like to smile on command or cry on command or something like that. They don't tell us to do something that we don't know how to do without giving us some tools. They actually give us tools, which is actually the part that I'm more interested in, since I approach these philosophies to try to fix myself. And they actually do give us, but we need to kind of, in some of these traditions, pry them out. So to achieve wisdom, start by reflecting upon your own self. Yeah, to be sure, some people really don't want to reflect on their own self because they are how full of demons and crap they are, so to speak, like really schizophrenic people that are really deformed. But little by little, there is always things that they can do to increase their physical and mental health in tandem. I think people that see stories of improvement of people. I've witnessed a guy that is a schizophrenic who was smoking very heavily, was drinking a lot, like more than 3 beers a day. Now he's severely cut down on his smoking, and also he's only drinking 1 or 2 glasses at the weekends. And he cleared his own space, his living space. And I thought that, and he celebrated that, and he did that without anyone shaming him to do that, since it came from his own volition. It has way more meaning to him. It means that he is taking the reins of his life away from some external power. And when we do that, we are set on a path, I believe. Feel free to comment on that. Otherwise, I'll show more stuff. We're almost nearing the end.
I was going to say, part of today's society is a little too much the motto of "fake it until you make it," and one of the big differences I see between Indian philosophy and Greek philosophy is Indian philosophy is much more integrated. They never lost that idea of thoughts and a way of living and all that one. And the Greeks were much more of a hard separation. And they kind of like explored words and ideas for their own sake, not necessarily for how it applied to the rest of their lives or anything else. And I think those, almost pointless excursions is something that you don't see a lot of in Indian philosophy there. Just going to tag on those.
Yeah, I think it would probably be wise for us to um, to get familiar with some more Indian philosophy before trying to characterize all of Indian philosophy. One of the things I remember Peter saying in the course is that whenever people talk about characteristic Indian philosophy or characteristic Western philosophy, they're very much in the land of fiction, because if you really take a look at all of Western philosophy, you'll find way too much diversity to put a lot of weight in sort of the qualifier Western philosophy, like is too much. Same thing with India, perhaps even more so. So yeah, I think maybe keep an open mind about what
There is
Indian
a slide
philosophy.
on that. Yeah.
What he, yeah. What
Yeah,
is
there's too much
philosophy?
there's too much diversity. There's too much diversity in Indian philosophy to put it in a stereotype and have a straight face about it. It cannot fly if the other person who is listening to you has read the Mahabharata and Ramayana and a bunch of Upanishads, probably like the 10 most famous, and also is knowledgeable about Buddhism, Jainism, and whatnot. He will never take anyone seriously, claiming that this thing is just all of Indian philosophy. That's it. Yeah, you cannot encapsulate it easily.
It's like
But
there being only one kind of Indian food. Indian food is
yeah,
very varied in and of itself.
yeah.
Yeah, it's
Also,
one of the dangers. We can't talk about Indian philosophy, Western philosophy without making that mistake. But yeah, we should have that in mind, because obviously, Fichtel talked about two psychological camps that you could put all of Western philosophers into. Well, two is better than just saying it's all one thing. But one of those two camps is exactly what Graham was describing in Western philosophy, is that psychological camp that's very focused on sort of the abstract principle. And you see it. Well, I won't name names, because the people that fit into that are sometimes very great philosophers, but you can see very readily who falls into one of those two camps. I imagine we'll find both of those in Eastern philosophy as well. Would be my guess. But let's have an open mind.
there's also here the concept of like the supreme achievement, like pointing towards the stars. So they have these really big words, moksha, mukti, or nirvana, that are like the ultimate thing. But yeah, the ultimate thing is like godliness, and godliness for all intents and purposes might be unrealistic, might be unattainable. But drawing from people like, so even though the sages or enlightened ones might not exist at all, we might be kind of idealizing them. We kind of might be exaggerating their superpowers, but they are still worthwhile in terms of divine, what I call divine mandate ethics. A guy needs role models. If a guy has crappy role models, the output probably won't be as good as if we have really good role models. And if we manage to make a role model as good as Spinoza made one for him, we might have a better chance at being of some use to our family and our overall community. So I would add here, aim and aspire for the stars. Even if you cannot reach them, you will increase the likelihood of at least achieving the planets. And then I'm quoting here from an active guy from feudal Japan who was a Buddhist. He even had a Buddhist name, Miyamoto Musashi. I wholeheartedly recommend his book for anyone who wants to increase their grit and ability to deal with adversity and be like an efficient life tactician. He was first and foremostly a philosopher of tactics. So yeah,
What's
maybe
this
one
book
of
called?
the Book of Five Rings.
Okay, thank you.
And then another Buddhist, much more recent, Bruce Lee, he said pretty much in the same spirit, don't fear failure, not failure, but low aim is the crime. In great attempts, it is glorious even to fail. And how many people can we say that are really aiming high? Many people aren't even aware how high really is, and they're just trying to keep alive. They're just toiling, as so to speak, in the mud. They haven't a figment of metaphysics pulling them up. Which we need to think about that. We need to figure out ways that we can migrate to higher states of quality of life as much as we can, even if it's not blatantly escalating the social ladder of classes. Even if we end up living our entire lives poor, but at least if we are funny about our poorness, like Diogenes the Cynic, and we can make fun of guys like Alexander. Well, that will be interesting at least. Then is a philosophical life of outer austerity and inner self-development colorless? A life better than that of an amoeba? So they pose this question in their podcast, which I thought was a really worthwhile question. And what the Buddhists tend to not say is something that the Epicureans say very much that very clearly, that I think the Buddhists should take the hint and also say it. A life where people are improving their own selves, their own minds, they acquire this latent and more persistent sense of satisfaction, that since it is related to stuff that's happening within, and stuff within is for a person that has invested in their self-development, in their self-knowledge and self-mastery. It's a bit more resilient to contingencies. And so even if shit really hits the fan and apocalypse happens, that person will at least think that, okay, I was living wisely until now, and I enjoyed every single day, thinking that the day before, the current day is the day before I die. So it really is happening, and I've kind of thought about this and my mortality enough so that I'm comfortable with it. And so the person will at first be tempted to be disturbed by the impending death, but they will pull themselves together again because of these tools that they've managed to develop or build or uncover or whatnot. There's also this idea of avoiding excesses of active and contemplative lives. I would advise these 4 steps. So contemplate to get enough self-knowledge, the atmasatya. Reassess relative importance of pain, pleasure versus the new yardstick that you've just figured out. You've put your measuring stick on the fulfillment from within, and which is shanti, inner peace. And then you can view pain and pleasure in a different light. You see it in comparison to another thing, and most people, I think, unfortunately, don't have this term of comparison, and so they really think that a life of practicing Buddhist or practicing Stoic or whatever is a colorless life. They really think that. They really think that because they don't get drunk every single day, or don't play video games a lot every single day, or don't binge on Netflix, their life will be boring. But I don't think that that's the case. That's only the case if people haven't invested enough in this inner path of self-development. So then, if a person has achieved at least some self-development, they become a bit less prone to anger, a bit less prone to envy, because they are much more fascinated by inner mental fulfillment. Okay, I'll shut up, and you guys, if you want to comment or disagree with me, or say that everything that I've said is crap, feel free, because I try to apply the things, and even if metaphysically I might not put them well into words, at least I'm trying to wrestle with these things and experiment them, not just trying to sound smart.
The one I'll slide in right now is to mention the book Art of War alongside Book of Five Rings and the others, as similar, having such a good philosophy and fitting in real well there. Tag.
Yeah, these two books are really work in tandem pretty well. They complement each other, I find.
Something that's really noticeable is as Buddhism has traveled the world, it's sort of picked up and intermingled with the religions and philosophies of different regions, and have become quite different things. So I think Buddhism traveled to China first, mostly just the western areas of China, didn't penetrate very deeply, and there was some exchange with Chinese ideas that sort of changed. I think Chan Buddhism, and then
Chan
it was
Buddhism.
this form of Chan Buddhism eventually spread to Japan, and that evolved into Zen Buddhism. But like a Zen Buddhist monk and a Theravada Buddhist monk will give you quite different advice to similar situations in many cases. Quite different religions. It's similar to how a Protestant Christian and a Catholic Christian could both kind of be said to be Christians, but there some fairly significant differences, some more superficial differences.
But there's a big difference between Christianity and, say, Buddhism. The Buddhists don't care if you believe in Buddha or not. At least the Buddhists that I know of that are worthy of their salt. Of course, there are always these imposters and fakers. While the Christians, the really devout Christians, they kind of tend, and this is true for the Abrahamic traditions overall. New Ecclesiastes talked to me about this the other day as well. He emphasized it really well. Like the Southern Baptists in the US, they really care that you worship their God in their way, according to their own denomination. Otherwise, they just say that they condemn you that you will go to hell. And Christians are condemning each other, telling that they will go to hell because they are interpreting and they're doing religion wrong. Which, if it weren't said, it would be even hilarious. But maybe it's said and hilarious at the same time. While Buddhists, they emphasize much more, at least the Buddhism that I've been studying, they emphasize much more aphorisms to re-engineer your thinking, and daily practices that are really testable and trainable, and you can put them to work and whatnot, and see if they work or not, and discard them if they don't. And it's really up to the individual to judge, and as they should. And so I think it's a major difference between the more Western Abrahamic traditions that emphasize very little self-development. They just tell you to love God and love God with all his heart, and love other people with all your heart, but they don't kind of give you tools of self-development for you to be better, be a better person with a more upstanding character. I think that is a glaring omission in Christianity, and even Buddhists. Kind of many of them fail to tell you how important it is to show the difference, the comparison between ephemeral happiness and the persistent happiness that comes from inner fulfillment. And I also think that the Buddhists kind of portray, they kind of strawman their own selves by saying that the self is non-existent. I think that my exegesis of this thought is that the self that is burnable, that you can burn away, it's not non-existent. but then there is the core of self that is aligned with nature, aligned with your own human nature, the best part of your own self, where you flourish, your unrealized potential that you can make happen, like applying your best faculties of intellect, creativity, and sociability, to live a pleasant life and help other people live a pleasant life around you. That brings a lot of fulfillment and satisfaction when you see that happening. And I think that they don't emphasize this nearly enough. They go all metaphysics, and perhaps they should figure out the character and self-development thing first, and then when we have the self-development thing really well fundamented and well laid out, then we can play in metaphysics lab. Yeah, that's my take on it. So these things are really interesting positions to start on, but we should uh, dismantle them and put them together again in our own mind, in our own way, like our own IKEA set of ideas and thought technology.
I was going to say, just the cynic in me says you left off rule number one in the Catholic, and the more the Christian churches, which is tithe your 10% to the church first. All that other stuff second.
Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, well, a god needs cash somehow. And moving on to a few references of scripture. So the our teachers, they mentioned many languages, and then let me check, just to give you a quick feel on the writings. So they mentioned this in the third episode, Kingdom for a Horse, where they mentioned that the coming of the Aryan people brought the Sanskrit language, religious beliefs, probably these Indo-European gods that we've seen, as well as horses, and the conversation about animals started to include the horse archaeologically after they arrived, and the Harappan and Mohenjo-daro civilizations, they fizzled out. They were replaced either gradually or at once by the Aryans. The Aryans were object of obsession, compulsive obsession, perhaps, by the Third Reich of Nazi Germany. And they say that the story of the Aryans' arrival to India has provoked a good deal of speculation, indeed wild speculation, indeed ideologically inspired fantasy dressed up as sober scholarship. I thought this was a gem of what they wrote, one of the best in these early episodes. While pre-Aryans mention no horses, Vedic texts from Aryan culture mention horses with great regularity. And then they even use horses, not just for riding and for work and whatnot. They even sacrifice the horses. So they were clearly abundant in horses. They brought so many horses. They started to become creative with the horses. They even looked at how the horse could be seen as the cosmos itself. So looking at something belonging to the cosmos and kind of extrapolating the entirety of cosmos from it. Then they mentioned the caste system with the Brahmins, Kshatriya, Vyasya, and Sudra. That is that kind of, there's kind of like a myth that tells the caste system arising from a god, a primal Purusha, who was sacrificed. And then some of the early Vedic texts we have already seen. And well, this is pretty much what I had in slides. Guys, feel free to add any comments. I know we're past three hours, but I think we should end with a few ending notes. If you guys have any thoughts to share, and then end, because we all can have use a rest and return next weekend.
I have one really quick quote to share. In a novel by Salman Rushdie, there was a character who left Kashmir to go get a medicine education in Germany. And it's said of this character that from his friends he learned that India, like radium, had been discovered by the Europeans. So I'll just...
In India is some powerful stuff if you really examine it, give it a shot.
That's true.
So maybe one last comment to make. Seeing as the self plays such an important role in a bunch of Indian philosophy, so we're told to reflect on our own self and thereby learn the whole world. And a lot of teachers teach there is no such thing as a self. And there's some very influential, 2 examples of very influential teachings about the self. And a lot of Indian philosophy can come across as a little bit self-obsessed in a way, maybe not exactly the same, but similar to how Aristotle's ethics can be, in some ways, characterized as a little too self-obsessed. But the point I wanted to make is that probably people talking about the self in India have spoken in different languages and in different contexts, in different worldviews, probably are using self in different ways, so that they have really different conceptualizations of what a self even is. And that's probably quite significant for interpreting what these thinkers mean when they say reflect on yourself and you will learn about the whole world, or when they say there is no such thing as a self. What exactly is it that they mean by self? And I don't really know. The one example I got from the material we were discussing today was the word purusa, which means self or person, but is at the same time it means something that the whole cosmos was made up of, and it features in this myth of the creation of the caste system. So I think that probably features in sort of like reflecting on yourself may involve reflecting on your place in the caste system, and that's all you need to know in that specific context. And then in other contexts, maybe not, but maybe someone like Siddhartha who abdicated his royal position and decided to become a preacher. That was really him stepping outside of his caste. And maybe for that kind of person who wants to say like, no, I don't want to be shackled to my position in society, say, well, that whole business of you having a self and a right place in society, that's a bunch of made up nonsense that the Vedic priest made up, and it's not real. That's one way. Adamson looks at takes a different angle on, like, if you don't think you have a self, maybe you may live less selfishly, and to sort of recognize. I don't know actually if Addison made that, but that's I remember that from somewhere. Anyway, so there's a bunch of ways to interpret that and to draw inferences from teachings about the self. We looked a little bit about the idea that you can know the whole world by reflecting on yourself. So something I'm curious about and that I'm hoping to learn more of as we go through this is sort of different ways in which Indian philosophers have conceptualized what a self even is. We did a bit of that exploring the Greek philosophy, the different ways philosophers conceptualize what a soul is. And so Thales had a conception of what souls are that makes a lot of sense for him to say that magnets had soul. It's different from, say, a typical Christian notion of a soul, or even the kind of Christian conception of soul that most scientists these days would also just say, well, there's no such thing as a soul, that's just a made-up fantasy by those stupid religious Christians. So maybe I'm transplanting the sort of narrative that scientists sort of saying, well, no, if you actually look in the brain and you do psychology, you'll find there's no such thing as a soul. And maybe the Buddha was doing something similar, like, well, yeah, like these priests say, I have a place in society and I have responsibilities to the broader society as a king to the broader society, but screw that, I don't want to be king, and they just made up a bunch of shit to guilt trip me into being king. I'm gonna go do my meditation thing. So those are some thoughts. Maybe I'll leave it there, give the others a chance to do closing thoughts.
Yeah, my take on what you're talking about is you're dealing with the self in the map territory divide. And it's the idea that the self is, on the one side, the self is what makes you an individual. It's what processes reality. And on the other side, it's the idea of the self. It's your idea of who you are, what you identify as. And that part is the illusion part. the part that's processing kind of has to exist. And that's, kind of the position that I've ended up on after years of going back and forth across the tennis net. So going to tag on that one. Another good session.
Zara, what additional comments would you like to add?
So I wrote a couple because we're almost wrapped up in time. So I wrote them in the comments. I think they show up in the YouTube videos. But that question you asked about what does it mean to deny that there's a self, and are the Buddhists obsessed with the self? Well, if the Buddhist understanding, or if one of the understandings from one of the sages is that knowledge of the world is knowledge of the self, then the statement there is no self is a nihilistic statement. It's a statement, it's of nihilism, that there's nothing of meaning. So it doesn't mean that we have to understand it to mean that. Just through that lens, that's what it would have to be.
I have an interpretation for it, which might make sense. It depends on the stage in which the person is engaged in this path of self-development. If the person is still self-centered, kind of childish, maybe the best thing to tell them, even if it's not literally true, is that you have no self, to kind of dispel the narcissistic tendencies that the person has. They keep repeating no self, no self, no self. Then the person will figure out that most of the personality that they have is implanted by social contingencies. It's not them. But the thing that will remain is more naturalistically them. It's more like the Tao flowing. They will just flow naturally, be themselves. They be their truest selves, even without all this crap or gunk that we accumulate throughout our lives. So I think it might be like more like a training tool than a metaphysical ontological statement. That's at least where I'm interpreting it. It's for character development, not as a scientific statement. And they have us fooled because we think, they have this metaphysics.
Well, there are. there are thinkers, and I'm not slagging off anybody. Every time I mention someone, I'm not saying that they're, don't listen to those people. They're brilliant. But Sam Harris type people who, again, are brilliant. I'm not picking on him. They will deny that there is a self in that literal sense as well. Like the scientific approach that says, well, let's ban all consideration of the subjective and then see where we can get thinking only in objective terms, then turns around and discovers, I've discovered nothing subjective. Well, you banned consideration of that before you started. It's not a surprise that you can't find it, and your lack of finding it doesn't mean it's not there. It means you've decided, and rightfully so, because that's how you can do science, to ignore all conversation about the subjective. But scientists, you have all the evidence in the world that it's like something to be. I mean, it's not like you lack the evidence of that. It's just that that's not meaningful in a peer review conversation. And so rightly, you ignore it. But some of them go so far, it's kind of a Quinian thing that says whatever's necessary to make science work must be true. And there's no reason to think that. We know it's like something to be. We don't need that to be discovered under a microscope, that the particles of the soul or whatever.
All right, guys.
Not that kind of an idea.
I would like to actually read a small paragraph that I wrote and also show a meme, so we end in a positive note. So my take is, this journey is far from ended. This journey of mythopoetic and stuff is far from ended, as we see nowadays many different crises plaguing humanity, some of them timeless, like famine, slave mentality, weak-mindedness, viciousness, plagues of pandemic proportions, weaponization of religion, where God figures and concepts are used as mouthpieces in interest of the vicious, social unrest and lawlessness. We also have some new challenges, like the possibility of being overpowered by our own technological creations, like having our impulses puppeteered around by digital entertainment and social media, or becoming subservient to an artificial general intelligence, a de facto God, whatever that may be, apparently for the first time in human history. So this is my argument, that we need to look at these myths and try to extract whatever value they might have, and then we need to re-engineer new myths. We need to re-engineer new myths that resonate even more deeply with ourselves, because we have benefited from the knowledge and wisdom on human nature. I hope at a better level than who came before us. And so I would like to show you guys, to end this meme here, portraying one of these rishis, probably Vyasa, the guy who compiled the Mahabharata. Well, this is like a, let's dispel the demons. Let's and well, I hope we will gain some interesting concepts from and docs and positions to examine, to smash to pieces and reconstruct in this travel through India. And that's that. Taking out.
All right. Thank you, everybody. That was really interesting. Thank you, Rogério. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Zara. Looking forward to seeing you again next time. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.